Bien, buenas tardes. En nombre del patronato y de la dirección de la Fundación Ramón Areces, les doy a todos ustedes la más cálida bienvenida a este acto, a este evento, y quiero expresar nuestra satisfacción y nuestro agradecimiento a todos ustedes por compartir hoy con nosotros este evento a una hora un tanto temprana, pero que así ha debido ser decidida. Quisiera expresar un especial agradecimiento por estar aquí a los profesores del MIT, Donald Sadoway, Jinhua, Zhao y Florian Allroggen, que van a actuar de ponentes en nuestro seminario de hoy. Anoche, en la cena de bienvenida, pude comprobar que no solo son unos extraordinarios expertos en sus campos, sino que además tienen un talante, una predisposición y un sentido del humor que facilitan enormemente la rápida creación de una corriente de amistad. Bienvenidos otra vez. Un agradecimiento muy especial al equipo del MIT, integrado por Klaus Schleicher y Eduardo Garrido y Luis, que anda por ahí. Compañeros de fatigas, eficaces gestores, cómplices y viejos y entrañables amigos, más amigos que viejos. Como digo siempre, alían la chispa latina con la eficacia sajona. El seminario de hoy, por cierto, uno de los varios programas de colaboración que tiene la Fundación Ramón Areces con el MIT, es el sexto en la historia de estos seminarios. En todos ellos hemos abordado cuestiones de alto interés y de actualidad y hemos intentado trasladar a la sociedad española las reflexiones y últimos análisis que se están produciendo en uno de los centros de pensamiento e investigación más importantes del mundo, como es el MIT. Basta recordar que en su historial figuran 98 adjudicatarios del Premio Nobel, lo que da la medida de la altura de sus trabajos. Hemos procurado en estos seminarios reflexionar sobre las grandes cuestiones que afectan a importantes sectores que rigen la vida colectiva de nuestras sociedades. El año pasado hablamos del futuro de la energía, abordando el cambio climático. Otros años hemos hablado de temas tales como la nanotecnología, tecnologías sostenibles que cambiarán el mundo y otros muchos más temas. Con la organización de estos seminarios, la Fundación Ramón Areces cumple con uno de sus objetivos esenciales y una de sus primeras prioridades, como son el hecho de presentar la vanguardia del conocimiento científico, tecnológico y sociológico a la sociedad española. Nuestra sociedad es muy dinámica, está en constante aceleración y demanda estar muy informada de los grandes cambios que se producen en el mundo. Convendrán conmigo que el tema que hemos seleccionado hoy sobre el futuro de la movilidad es un tema de enorme importancia, de gran actualidad y que plantea muchos interrogantes para el futuro, entendiendo por futuro los grandes ejes que van a gobernar nuestras vidas en las próximas décadas. Cuando uno se pone a pensar, por ejemplo, las implicaciones que puede tener el modo de transporte desde su residencia hasta el lugar de trabajo, ¿cuántas implicaciones vitales básicas están en juego? La movilidad y sus modalidades juegan ya un papel trascendental a la hora de tomar o decidir opciones básicas en la vida de cada individuo, por no hablar de las implicaciones colectivas para nuestra sociedad. Multitud de factores intervienen en este proceso, incluyendo el medio ambiente, el cambio climático, la concreción de la sociedad del ocio, las costumbres, el auge y decadencia de barrios enteros de nuestras ciudades, etc. Podemos también pensar en la incidencia fundamental que tendrá en la vida de los individuos y en el devenir de nuestras sociedades las modalidades que se pongan en la regulación del tráfico aéreo. ¿Podrán las nuevas tecnologías modificar a nuestro favor estas preocupantes tendencias actuales? Nuestros amigos del MIT nos van a ilustrar sobre esta y otras muchas cuestiones. Y termino como terminé el año pasado. Como decía Cocteau, hay verdades que uno solo puede decir después de haberse ganado el derecho a decirlas. Este es el caso del MIT. Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra Klaus Schleicher.
Gracias, Ramón. Bueno, gracias, Ramón. Aparte de MIT, le quiero dar también la bienvenida. Buenas tardes. En la vida pasan cosas buenas y cosas malas. La mejor cosa que me ha pasado a mí, que me casó con una española. Y con eso se pegó la idioma. Así que voy a intentarlo hacerlo en castellano. Cada vez en cuando me faltan las palabras, pero normalmente las cosas técnicas no hablamos, pero lo voy a intentarlo. Y no sé, no voy a perder mucho tiempo de hablar mucho de MIT, que somos 1.100 profesores con 3.700 investigadoras y investigadores, y gastamos casi 1.800 millones de dólares al año para haciendo investigaciones. La misión de MIT es hacer investigaciones que mejoran el mundo y que educan los científicos del futuro, ¿no? Que ayudan para mejorar el mundo, ¿no? Y 12 años nos han arrancado número 1 en la Escuela de Ingeniería, pero tenemos muchísimas escuelas más y tenemos 9 premios Nobel y un montón de otras cosas que hacemos. Y en las próximas diapositivas quiero pasar un poco qué ha pasado en los últimos 2 años durante la pandemia, qué son las cosas que son nuevas que han salido de MIT. El año pasado le hemos traído al profesor White del Plasma Infusion, que inventó unos materiales nuevos. Esto es un material de alta temperatura que soporta 1000 amperios y con esto hemos capaz de sacar unos imanes que soportan un campo de magnético de 22 Tesla. Es el campo magnético más alto que existe en el mundo. Y con esto lo podemos realizar económicamente el tema de fusión. Y el tema de fusión nos puso, también el profesor White tenía la idea de crear una plataforma que se llama ARC, que está al tamaño de Tomac, pero muchísimo, 40 veces más pequeño y mucho más económico. Y también la idea es de colaborar con industria que nos apoya a comercializar estos productos. Y hemos empezado a trabajar casi con 6 compañías en España, con el apoyo de Cereti, que en España había un montón de compañías que estaban trabajando en el tema de fusión y hemos visto un poco que el conocimiento que hay por aquí y la colaboración ya ha empezado. Es una cosa fantástica. Y también tenemos un plan muy agresivo de realizar la fusión comercial en el 2030, que tenerlo comercial disponible, ¿no? Y ya hemos fundado una compañía que se llama Commonwealth Fusion, que empezó a crear el primer reactor de fusión que va a producir 100 megavatios de corriente net positivo en el 2025, en 18 meses. Y esto es una foto de la construcción del reactor que solamente ocupa 20 metros cúbicos. Así es pequeñito y muy efectivo, pero la idea es también de poner este reactor en marcha en 18 meses y aprender en los próximos 5 años cómo se comportan los materiales y que tenemos que aprender que ponemos miles de estos reactores en marcha en el 2030. Y con una botella de agua salada del mar se puede crear la energía de España por un año. Así va a ser una energía renovable a casi costo cero. Otras cosas que han pasado en los próximos 2 años, hemos sacado un aparatito que convierta agua salada en agua potable. Esto es un aparatito que es portable, que se puede llevar y funciona con con energía solar, que produce casi 10 litros de agua potable con 26 vatios de corriente. Así funciona con baterías o con solo velar. Es una cosa que hacía falta en sitios del mundo, ¿no? Y luego, en el verano de 2020, hemos lanzado una misión al Marte con el apoyo de NASA, con un aparatito que se llama MOXIE. El MOXIE device es un aparatito que está creando oxígeno, es una de esas palabras que no me salen, ¿no? Oxígeno en el Marte, que se hace falta cuando llegan las personas en el 2035 al Marte, está creando también el oxígeno que hacía falta. El Marte tiene una atmósfera que tiene muchos CO2 y esos son materiales que usamos y ha llegado, me parece, en el 2021 en el Marte y ahora está produciendo oxígeno en el Marte. Era una cosa de MIT que ha salido también durante las investigaciones. Durante la pandemia, a mí me han pinchado 4 veces y no me ha gustado ni uno. Y en el futuro, no hace falta que pinchemos a la gente para las vacunas, lo vamos a inhalarlo. Y ya tenemos tecnología que es posible que la gente pueda respirar las vacunas en el futuro. A mí las agujas a pincharme no me gustan y a la mayoría de la gente tampoco, ¿no? Bueno, y las fibras, o la Europa que llevamos, ya no tiene innovación hace miles de años, ¿no? Y en los últimos 2 años hemos sacado las fibras que también tienen unos sensores que pueden medir la señal de salud de una persona, que se puede ventilar cuando una persona tiene calor o que puede calentarlo cuando tiene frío. Son fibras inteligentes que van a venir en el futuro, que van a mejorar la forma como vivimos y cómo lo sentimos. Y también tiene muchas aplicaciones médicas, ¿no? Y yo siempre digo, la cosa importante de MIT, como que somos un instituto non-for-profit, en todas las startups que han salido de MIT. Y desde los últimos 40 años eran 33.000 compañías que han salido. Y uno de ellos son bien conocidos, que ya no son más startups, pero solamente que meterlo con el impacto que tiene MIT, ¿no? Intel, por ejemplo, era una startup, ¿no? iRobot, que produce el robot que limpia la casa. Dropbox, Thermo Fisher, Blackstone, HP, Gillette, son todas compañías que han salido de MIT, ¿no? Y en nuestra oficina, nuestra misión es de llevar las investigaciones, las ideas de MIT a la industria. Yo siempre digo, si lleva MIT a la industria y los problemas de industria a MIT, lo que está pasando en el medio es el valor real. Y nuestra oficina ya tiene 75 años que se encarga de esta misión, ¿no? De haciendo el puente que está pasando en MIT. El MIT también es un sitio que atrae el talento del mundo. Tenemos ciudadanos de todo el mundo en MIT trabajando que quiere tener impacto al mundo, que quiere mejorar cómo vivimos en este mundo. Bueno, con eso no tengo nada más, son una cosa breve, las cosas que han pasado en los últimos 2 años. Les dejo la palabra a mi colega Eduardo Garrido, también José Ramos, que está con nosotros de nuestra oficina, ¿no? Y adelante. Muchísimas gracias.
Buenas tardes, bienvenidos y un saludo especial también para los que están siguiendo este simposio de forma remota a través de live streaming. Como se mencionó antes, vamos a abordar el futuro de la movilidad con 3 enfoques bien diferentes. Uno desde el lado de la electromovilidad, otro de la movilidad urbana y por último la sostenibilidad en la aviación. Vamos a empezar tenemos el lujo de contar con un profesor emérito del MIT, Donald Sadoway. Donald Sadoway es profesor emérito de Química de Materiales en el Departamento de Ciencia e Ingeniería de Materiales del MIT. El profesor Sadoway es autor de más de 180 artículos científicos y titular de más de 37 patentes estadounidenses. Su contribución incluye 2 avances muy disruptivos, la batería de metal líquido y la electrólisis de óxido fundido, que produce metal a partir del mineral sin emisión de CO2. En 2012 fue nombrado por la revista Time como una de las 100 personas más influyentes del mundo. Y en 2022 ganó el premio al inventor europeo. No es europeo, no sé cómo lo consiguió, pero bueno. Su ponencia va a hablar sobre obstáculos en el camino hacia la adopción generalizada de vehículos eléctricos. Profesor Sadoway, it's your turn.
que le ponga el suyo porque va a usar el suyo.
That's the way we rehearsed. That's okay. This here.
Okay.
That's good like this. And then we can put this like so. Okay, that looks good.
Wait 1 second.
No, not that one. Ahora. Okay, I recognize this. You like the suspense? I do too. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. This is very boomy. It sounds like I'm in a, I don't know, it sounds like I'm very powerful, but I want to be a little more modest. So I heard Eduardo say he doesn't know how I could possibly win the European Patent Award. They have a category for non-EPO applicants. So I was the winner for the non-EPO applicants. So if I move to Europe, I will be disqualified, so that's okay. All right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about energy storage and how it plays a role in the adoption of electric vehicles. And this title, I give credit to my colleague, Jinhua, who will be the next speaker. Jinhua, who is the lead of the MIT Mobility program, fished me out of the ether and invited me to talk to him about batteries, and then we've developed a collegial relationship, and it was his suggestion to call bumps along the road, because it is a bumpy road, and I will explain what I mean by this. So I don't have to give you a big lecture about why we want sustainability, but I like this image. This is a fantastic image. It reminds us that everything that we value as important in devices that powers our 21st century lifestyle is powered by electricity. And this image shows you where you see light, you see the modern world. Where you don't see light, one of two conditions exists. Either the place hasn't been electrified or nobody lives there. And if the place hasn't been electrified, there's no more important gift you can give those people than electricity. Without electricity, you can't participate in the 21st century. But that electricity must be sustainable electricity. We're not going to build gigantic coal-fired power plants and so on. So I like that. And so it always reminds me. By the way, you know this is not an image. This is a collage. You know when it's light over here, it's dark over here. If the world ever looks like this, it's a really bad day. But I tell this to some people, and they go, no, that's NASA, Earth at night. No, it isn't. You missed a day of school. There's something wrong. So the path to sustainability is to electrify everything. Everything that can be electrified. So I say that if it can be electrified, it will be electrified. There are certain processes that can't be electrified, and we'll have to work around those. But I'm an electrochemist. You're right, I was in materials chemistry, but my specialty is electrochemistry. And electrochemistry uses electricity to drive electrical processes, and I'll give you a couple of examples. So we have to electrify everything. And now that includes transportation. So why are we seeing such a slow, widespread adoption of electric vehicles? Well, there's things that have to come into play. First of all, we need cost parity. This is the first time with the electric car we're being asked to pay more for less. I didn't buy the smartphone because I was getting less, and the government subsidized the purchase. I bought the smartphone because it gave me enhanced capabilities that the other phone didn't have. It's not a phone. Phone is the name, but it is a computer. It is a broadcast media. It has everything in the palm of the hand. But the electric car doesn't drive as far. I can't find a place to refuel it, and on and on and on. And you want me to buy this thing. So we have to get the cost parity. And what's the big problem? The big problem is the battery. When you buy an electric car, you buy a battery with some coach work. It's all about the battery. And we're not there yet. And so we have to get the battery costs down because that defines the cost of the vehicle. So look at this. This is the electric vehicle. This is the kilograms of copper. Look, it's dominated by graphite. This is the nickel, the manganese, the cobalt. Lithium is light. It's large in mole number, but in terms of total mass, it's small. This is internal combustion engine. So for those of you who are interested in supply chain management and so on, this is your opener. All of this stuff we have to put into the car, and we have to get the price down. The second thing is range anxiety. The electric vehicle doesn't go as far as the internal combustion vehicle. And that's a deterrent. People don't want to buy a car. If I buy an electric car and I'd want to drive from Boston to New York and come back, I can't do that. And I'm not prepared to be running around Manhattan looking for a charging point. That's crazy. So we have to have access to charging points. We don't have enough charging points. And without that, we need to have massive build-out to achieve that. And the way to accelerate that is with storage. So let's do some simple math. Let's say you have an EV that has a 100 kilowatt hour pack. That's an amazing amount of energy, 100 kilowatt hours. And you want to charge to 50% of full charge in 1 hour. Well, that would be 50 kilowatts. Well, if you want to do it in 1 hour, that would be a 50 kilowatt line. 50 kilowatt line. But no motorist is willing to wait for 1 hour. Motorist wants to do it in what? I don't know, 6 minutes. Even that, you're testing people's patience. 6 minutes. Well, that's 6 times 10. That's 1/10 of an hour, right? So you're talking about 5C charge. That would require 500 kilowatts. 500 kilowatt line. All right? Now, look at this station. How many? Can you count? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 of these, if we had 500 kilowatt lines, that's 4.5 megawatts, not hours, megawatt feed continuously so that cars can be parked at each one of those stations. Where are you going to get that from? You don't have it in the ground. Do you think when you go to put gasoline in your car, do you think that each one of these pumps is connected to a refinery? No. These pumps go down. There's a big cauldron beneath a cistern, beneath the pavement, and there are hundreds of thousands of liters of gasoline down here. So why don't we do the same thing with storage? So that behind each one of these is a storage battery that contains the requisite amount, maybe 200 kilowatt hours. Huh? And with 200 kilowatt hours, then you would be able to do B2B, battery to battery. So the battery has 200 kilowatt hours. You pull up with your car. You want 50 kilowatt hours. I'll give you a battery that you can drain in 6 minutes, 50 kilowatt hours. You drive away, and then the battery continues to trickle charge up. This is a different way to think. But instead, we're going to put, do you know how much copper you're going to need to wire all of that stuff? I'll tell you in a minute. All right, this is just in Financial Times recently. This is the frustration that people are feeling. Here they're saying that people are starting to abandon their EVs because they get to the charging point and the interface doesn't work, or they try to plug it in and the connector is wrong, or it's not long enough, and so on. After a few of those experiences, you say, I don't want this thing anymore. So this is manageable. The other problem here is singular dependence on lithium ion. Lithium ion was invented 30 years ago, right, for devices like this, handheld devices. It was never intended for big cars, but it's scaled up. So what do we have as a result? Supply chain constraints. Nobody in 1991 imagined, when I showed you that graph with the amount of nickel, the cobalt, the graphite, nobody imagined we'd be at the breaking point. So we have supply chain constraints. And we thought originally it was just there isn't enough of the material. You know, 2/3 of the world's cobalt is in one country, Congo. It's worse than that. Now you see countries are putting curbs on exports. And that means that sometimes you can't get things because, look at the number of export controls up to 18,000 from 3,000, and it's going up, up, up. Sometimes taxes, sometimes it's forbidden to export certain resources, either raw or finished, and so on. And this is just going to get worse. So what's the remedy? Well, there's two remedies. One is to onshore everything, to look for cobalt in Europe, to look for cobalt in North America. That's not my approach. My approach is to invent a new chemistry that contains no cobalt. That's the way. You invent beyond. You invent your way out of your mess. You don't look for government subsidy. You invent. That's what people should do at MIT. All right. And so that's going to lead to price increases. So this is a chart that I had from several years ago. This was done by Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And what you see here is back in year 2010, it was $1,000 a kilowatt hour for lithium ion. When I started working on liquid metal battery in 2005, guess what the cost of lithium ion battery was? $2,000 per kilowatt hour. Can you imagine putting a 100 kilowatt hour pack on a car at a capital cost of $2,000 per kilowatt hour? This is crazy, but look at what's happened. So what we have here is these people, they took these data, you see they're pretty jiggly, and they fit it to a semi-logarithmic plot. And the semi-logarithmic curve has a coefficient 0.19, and they declare without any proof 19% learning rate. I don't know where you get this stuff from. It's a business school mystery. So 19% learning rate, and now with the data from here to 2015, they're forecasting it will be $73 per kilowatt hour by 2030. Now, what do we know? We know that by 2022, the cell cost was down to 109, and they predicted it just keeps going. But what happened around 2022? That's where the supply chain got taut, and now it's demand exceeds supply. And now what happens is, if you want to be polite, you'll say this curve levels out. I say it's actually going to start going up now. This was the minimum price. And sure enough, this was the publication just about a week ago. And this shows the blue is the cell cost, and the light blue is the premium to put the pack together. So what do you see? Cell cost is going down, 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 down to 2021, and now 22 goes up. And now we'll see what happens this year. My prediction is it's going to go up again. And that's not going to augur well for greater adoption of the EV, because the price of the car is going up now. All right, so we better do something about it. Break the reliance on lithium ion. So I said back in 2012 when I gave my TED talk, if you want to make something dirt cheap, you should make it out of dirt, and preferably dirt that's locally sourced. I said this in 2012. I didn't realize what I was saying. I just thought this would be a sensible thing. I didn't realize that I was foretelling supply chain constraints. You make dirt. I said the way I should supervise my students, I go into my backyard with a shovel. I bring a shovel full of dirt, I put it on the lab bench, and I say, people, you're going to make a battery out of what's inside that pile of dirt. If you can't make it out of this, then I don't want it. There are vast swaths of the periodic table I won't allow my students to touch, because that stuff won't scale. I can make a gorgeous battery out of tellurium, but tellurium is about as earth abundant as gold. So I don't care. There just isn't enough of it. So you have to think about these things. So I want a new battery chemistry with no cobalt, no nickel, no lithium, no graphite. Just invent this stuff out of the picture. And by the way, no fire. So what I did was I flipped the research paradigm, because the research paradigm in the university, I think, is flawed for this application. What do I mean? In the university, the idea is to invent the coolest chemistry. Just go really fantastic chemistry, publish in the top tier journals, and then somehow maybe there's a startup company somewhere in there. Klaus told us about all of the support MIT gives for startup companies. My experience has been somewhat different. But anyways, the thing is, with this really cool chemistry, without regard to cost, you don't know where it's going to go. You think, just as that Bloomberg New Energy Finance curve, the cost will fall, and it will, but it won't fall low enough. I say you have to think about cost on day one. That's why I say cost-informed discovery, not cost engineering and getting things more and more efficient. No. You think about cost before you go into the lab. And you only work with things that are scalable, cheap, and so on. So that's how I started. And so I looked at the periodic table and I said, obviously it's not going to take any lithium. So what's the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust? It's not iron, it's aluminium. And what's the most abundant non-metal? It's sulfur. So I said, those are my bookends. Aluminium and sulfur. Make a battery out of this. And so we did. So aluminium on one side, sulfur on the other side, and somewhere in here is an electrolyte. And with the electrolyte, we can have aluminium ion go through. So on discharge, the aluminium goes into solution, becomes aluminium ion, and these electrons go through the external circuit. So this is the battery giving us current. And on the other side, the aluminium doesn't intercalate. The aluminium combines with sulfur to make aluminium sulfide. And then on charge, we break up the aluminium sulfide and electroplate aluminium. What am I going to use for an electrolyte? Can't be water. And I certainly won't use the volatile flammable electrolyte that we use in lithium-ion batteries, because that just replacing the lithium-ion flaming cell with an aluminium-sulfur flaming cell. So I looked at solid polymer electrolyte. Couldn't make that work. I looked at ionic liquids. They're frightfully expensive. Violates my premise of cost effectiveness. And we came upon some low melting molten salts. And that's what we invented. So this is what the battery looks like. You can start here with the aluminium metal electrode on the bottom. On the top is sulfur. And sulfur is an insulator, so we put some carbon particles in there to give it conductivity. And then the molten salt electrolyte in between. And we want to be able to roll this up, so we put an insulator here. This could be something like fiberglass. It doesn't have to be a fancy polymer. And over here, the current collector on the back side here, it could also be aluminium. So we have aluminium here, we have aluminium here. And as I say, we want to curl it up, so we'll put some kind of an insulator here. And that's the structure of the battery. And so what are the attributes? The capital cost of the active components of the aluminium and sulfur is $2 per kilowatt hour, which means you can build this battery at the cell cost for $9 per kilowatt hour. I was showing you $109 before. So this is really cost advantage here. And this can serve in multiple markets. So I initially am looking at getting into long duration storage where this thing can discharge over 40 hours. And then it could also do frequency regulation, things like ancillary markets on the grid. So it can discharge in 3 minutes, 20D. And all of this is sourced in North America, no China, no Congo. It could be sourced in Europe, no China, no Congo. So this is thinking ahead. And this is a little bit of data. I don't want to bore you with a lot of battery data, but this is going out to 900 cycles. And this is at discharge rate of D/2. It's 2-hour discharge rate. And you may say, wow, that's quite a fade rate. I'm saying, wait a minute. You don't compare this to lithium-ion battery today. You compare this to lithium-ion battery in 1991, in its infancy. And I guarantee you, lithium-ion battery in 1991, it wouldn't get to 900 cycles. After about 500 cycles, it would be off the graph. So, you know, just saying, you know, I know from experience, when you try to innovate in this arena, you don't get greeted with bouquets of flowers. You get all of the rotten tomatoes being thrown at you. So I know how to handle this. This is fine. This is fine for this stage. And look at, this is at the D/5. That's 5-hour discharge. This is now 6-minute discharge. This is 3-minute discharge. It's still giving output at 3-minute full discharge. All right. Now, this is not just me making up things. There are many people in batteries. You know, Thomas Edison wrote in 1883, when a man starts to work on a secondary battery, it brings out the latent propensity to lie. And it's true to this day. There's all kinds of people lie in the battery field, but not me. How do you know? This was published in Nature in August of last year. Fast-charging aluminum chalcogen batteries resistant to dendritic shorting. When we charge really quickly and we're depositing aluminum, we don't grow dendrites which short the cell. That's why you don't see lithium metal batteries, because the lithium metal batteries, they're shorting. They just bring on those fires sooner. So if you hear somebody talking about a quote-unquote breakthrough, 2 things you should look for. Look for a paper in top-tier journal, or look for a U.S. patent. If you have the paper in the top-tier journal and the U.S. patent, that means you've been scrutinized. Otherwise, it's just, okay. So I started a company. I called it Avanti because I drove the Avanti automobile, and I loved the car, and I thought, well, someday I'll name a company that. And so we got funding. I started in 2021. I had to raise money during the time of COVID from behind a computer screen. It was very difficult. We got funded by Breakthrough Energy and by the Italian energy company Eni, and then more recently by Abdul Latif Jamil investment management firm. So that's got us started. And we're out in Watertown, Massachusetts, about 1.5 years old. And this is after about 9 months. This is a cell that's about 2 amp hours, and this is the same in wound configuration. So this is real. We're making these things. All right. Now, I'm going to shift gears a little bit about metals. The last thing I'm going to talk about is copper. And I'm saying that copper shortage could stall the green transition. Copper shortage. I showed you how much copper we need. If you think about the cars times the need for the infrastructure, all that has to be wired with copper. And that means without copper, the bumps will become potholes, and the potholes will become sinkholes, and that's the end of the green transition. So we have to do something about it. People talk, I've seen it in all the financial journals, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, mining, mining, mining. No, mining alone is not the solution. You cannot draw cable with copper ore. You have to convert copper ore into copper metal. And the legacy extraction process is filthy. It's 100 years old, and it's very harmful to the environment. So if you put the electric vehicle on the showroom floor and you look at all the antecedent damage done to the environment before you sit in the car and drive off to the lot, you have so much to overcome. So this is something that's really bad. So I'm saying that there needs to be innovation in copper metallurgy. So that's one of my other pet projects right now. So as was mentioned, I retired from MIT. That's the formal name. I left MIT. I left MIT because I took a sabbatical. I founded 3 companies and filed 9 patent applications and said, when I got back to MIT, I said, why am I wasting my time here? It's too slow. I can go faster. And so I decided to leave. I founded Avanti, I founded Pure Lithium, and I wanted my own skunk works to be able to do rapid testing, so I called it Sadoway Labs. And it's a foundation. And so it's R&E, research and education. I bring in postdocs, and I give them the Sadoway treatment, and they leave ready to invent, as opposed to university-trained people who are scholars. The professor makes a copy of himself, become another scholar to write another paper. I'm being cruel here, but I'm talking straight. You know, tenure means never having to say you're sorry. Tenure means retirement means you can say anything you want. So I will just give you the truth. So I founded this, and I got Schmidt Futures to support. Eric Schmidt was the CEO of Google for many years, and he and his wife set up a foundation to fund the unfundable. And what he's been funding, for the most part, has been health issues, bio, and also some social issues. And I contacted him, I said, I don't see any tough tech here. Why don't you do something in tough tech? And he said, well, make me a proposal. And I said, look, why don't we talk about climate change mitigation? And my approach is extreme electrochemistry. That's my special approach, is extreme electrochemistry. What is extreme electrochemistry? Non-aqueous. I don't touch water. Water for electrochemistry is too wimpy. I don't touch it. So I look at molten salts, start at body temperature, go to 2,000 degrees Celsius, or there's another class of liquids called molecular liquids, things like thionyl chloride, DMSO, dimethyl sulfoxide, and so on. And they will take you from about 100 degrees to minus 100 degrees. So these two classes of liquids with extreme electrochemistry can open up metals extraction, new battery possibilities, and so on. So this is just a short catalog of the things that I'm working on. Copper, brand new process to extract copper without hydrometallurgy, without acid leaching and all of this other stuff. Rare earth metals. We've made discoveries of rare earth oxides in the United States. Nobody in the United States knows how to extract metal from rare earth oxides. They're going to end up shipping it to China anyways. Well, I'll solve that one. I know what to do. No hydrometallurgy. And now, this one is called Zapper, CO2. Can you imagine if I put something on the flue that comes out of a coal-fired generator where the CO2, which is hot, it's probably over 1,000 degrees Celsius, and I bubble it through one of my molten salts and electrochemically destroy CO2, which means that we can continue to burn fossil fuels while we continue to train up to 100% renewables without CO2 emissions. Why don't people think that way? Instead, they say, close all the coal-fired plants. Well, yeah, you can do that. If you want to get clean air, close all industry. Close all industrial human activity. The air will be clean. People will be somewhat annoyed, I suspect, but that's one way. So this is another one. And then I've got this battery. You know, Florian is going to talk about mobility, and I've been talking to some people. They want to have airplanes flying, you know, as you go up in altitude, the temperature falls. What if I gave you a battery that could charge and discharge at minus 100 degrees C up to plus 80 degrees C? It could operate anywhere on planet Earth. You can park it in the Spanish sun, the blazing sun of Spain, park it there and not have the battery consuming its electricity to generate the air conditioning to prevent the lithium-ion battery from exploding. This thing will just sit there. It doesn't matter. So if all of these things come to pass, the bumps will turn into a speedway, and we will have electrified transportation. So I think that's probably a good place to stop, and I'm going to park it there and turn it back over so we can get to questions. Do you want to get to questions now or questions later? All right, fine. So I'm going to park it here, and I'm going to invite your questions. You notice what I didn't say? I didn't say, are there any questions? You know why you don't? Why I never asked that? Because there's two answers to that question. Are there any questions? Maybe the answer is no. No, I don't want that. Or watch this one. Are there any questions? What does that tell you? It tells you I'm not interested. So instead I say, now it's time for your questions. Please.
No questions? A lo mejor después, ¿no? Vamos a tener un panel de 30 minutos. Ahí hay una pregunta. It's a question.
Just the very end I didn't hear. To develop which?
How much time will it take you to develop these kind of batteries?
Okay, so do you want this one?
Yeah.
This one here?
Yeah.
Well, with proper funding, we can compress the timeline. With any of new technologies, you're talking 10 to 20 years. There's a story about President Kennedy. If I say 10 to 20 years, every automaker will leave the room. So I don't have that time. I talked to people back in the 1990s from the automobile industry in the United States. And I said, it's probably going to take 5 years. And they said, we don't have the time. Now it's 20 years later. They still don't have the new chemistry. So President Kennedy comes upon his gardener. And he says, has there been any movement on that tree that I asked you to plant? And the gardener says, oh, I have it. It's up in the shed. But that thing doesn't flower for 200 years. And President Kennedy says, you better put it in the ground this afternoon. And that's what we should be doing. If it's a 20-year project, start now, and with adequate funding, compress the timelines. If we just keep putting it off, it doesn't happen. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so we'll be up to our necks in lithium-ion supply chain issues. So you want to get it started, come and see me. We'll get the thing started this afternoon. There's still some time. There's one over here.
Allí, después allí y después al fondo.
Hello. Is there here? Hello? Is there any downside with respect to the current lithium batteries, the last one?
For the last one?
Yeah.
Downside?
Yeah.
Not that I can think of.
I mean,
I'm not going to use supply chain constrained, and this thing is non-flammable. If it can't burn and you can build it cheaply, what's the downside? Yeah, it's going to make some people who are heavily invested in lithium ion, it's going to make some people very angry, to which I say, sucks to be you, I don't care.
Okay, if I understood properly, you left MIT and to found your own company, this Avanti, isn't that right?
Correct.
And this company is, the purpose is to produce a sulfur aluminum battery.
Correct.
I would like to know which is the situation right now. You are producing already batteries that are being commercialized, or you intend to commercialize these batteries in 1 year, 2 years? How is also the size of the company? How many people you have? And to have a look at your company and to see how has proceeded.
Yes, so the intention is to get to the point at which the battery will be produced commercially. This is a company that's 1.5 years old. And the first order of business is to take what was done at the campus at MIT and to demonstrate the steps of scalability and to go through the various technology readiness levels. And you don't go from level 1 to level 10 in one jump. So you have to go little by little. And we raised a modest amount of money for the Series A, and we have about 20 people right now in Watertown, and we're sorting out all of the upscaling issues until we have a battery that's about 5 amp hours, the size that would power your phone, And then with that, we go to the next phase and the next phase and so on. As far as how long it will take, it could take up to 20 years. It could take less than 10 years. But I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, we know that tough tech, it's a 20-year journey. And as a result, you don't see a lot of money going into it. Some people put money in, but they grow impatient. They don't have that because the venture capital expectations are here. And the amount of time and the amount of money is here. And so they say they're different, but eventually they say, I don't know, maybe you guys don't have the right people, maybe this technology really doesn't work. They fall off. So it takes time. But you know, Niels Bohr said the prediction is always difficult, especially when it's about the future, so don't ask me how long it's going to take. But I know from the liquid metal battery, it's taken 11 years, and now we're releasing the first product into customer hands. I hope that from all the things that I've learned from that journey, maybe I can compress the next timeline, but it doesn't make me shy away. I'm always asked, does radical innovation come with risk? And I said, what are you kidding? You want radical innovation and zero risk? No, they're orthogonal. They're like this. You know? Yeah.
Yes, if I'm allowed to step out a little bit from mobility into the power grid. You know that Tesla just a few days ago published what they call their Master Plan 3, in which they claim that you could run a power grid only with intermittent renewables because you could have enough storage, energy storage, to work into the dynamics. Which are your thoughts about those kinds of batteries or battery storage, energy storage for the power grid? Thank you.
Well, for the power grid, this is massive. You're talking about hundreds of megawatt hours and up, and lithium ion is clearly unsuitable. Just look to what the big fire that was in Moss Landing, just north of Monterey, California. 200 megawatt hour facility caught fire. You can't put the fire out. The fumes were so bad that they closed the Pacific Coast Highway. So for people to write these things, this is totally irresponsible. And I give no credence to this. And there are other people. There's a guy at Stanford who says we need no new discoveries. We can go to net zero by before 2050 with the technology we have in hand. These people are either idiots or frauds or both. I'll be quite honest with you. This is very harmful information. It's just simply not true. Did I answer your question? Or?
I was saying, did you tell this to Elon Musk? Because Tesla is very adamant about this view of how energy storage will work in the future.
He has no expertise in massive stationary storage. It was one of his stationary storage facilities that caught fire in Moss Landing. So if he wants to pose that as the exemplar of what we can do with lithium-ion batteries at massive scale, I say, do you want this in your backyard? I don't. This is completely stupid, completely stupid. It's actually very irresponsible. Just really, it saddens me to see this kind of irresponsible behavior.
Ok, no hay más preguntas. Igual tenemos una pregunta ahí.
Thank you. What is the product of burning hydrocarbons without producing CO2? What is the product of burning hydrocarbons and not producing CO2?
Oh, so I'm talking about where you take whatever hydrocarbons you want, you're burning them, and you're generating, among other things, CO2. And I'm saying take that gas before it leaves and then convert that by electrochemistry in a medium, which is either the molecular liquid or the molten salt. And using photovoltaic electricity, obviously is going to take energy, and you use that in order to destroy the CO2, and you're allowed to take the thermal value of the burning of the hydrocarbons without CO2 emissions. And I don't know what the product is because I don't know what the reaction is just yet. It could even be giving a useful product. I mean, there's one scenario where you convert the CO2 to CO, which is then combustible, and you go back and you have this chain. But you know, it's premature to talk about that. I'm just shocked that nobody asked these audacious questions. That's what I do. I ask audacious questions.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Sadoway, for your insightful thoughts. You have to say, like we hear always in MIT, when you think that the only tool you have is a hammer, all problems look like a nail. This is thinking about lithium ion. El siguiente ponente es Jinhua Zhao. Jinhua Zhao es profesor asociado de Planificación Urbana y de Transporte en el MIT. Él integra el pensamiento conductual y computacional para descarbonizar el sistema de movilidad global. El profesor Zhao fundó y dirige la iniciativa de movilidad del MIT, es el anfitrión del MIT Mobility Forum y dirige el laboratorio de movilidad urbana JTL y el laboratorio de tránsito en el MIT. Su ponencia es sobre comportamiento y computación, movilidad urbana en el futuro del trabajo. Profesor Zhao.
Great. Thanks, Eduardo, for the introduction. And good afternoon. Really great to be here. Thanks to Foundation for inviting me here. I want to say one thing about Professor Donald Sadoway. Until I meet him, I cannot imagine a chemistry lecture can be so entertaining. Right? If he was my professor, I may end up in the chemistry as a discipline here, but thanks, Don, for that. Right? The second thing is I've been in Madrid for about a week now. I would say anyone who claims work with cities or with urban transportation should come here, live for 1 year before saying anything. Right? It gives a different imagination of what city can be. Right? So I'm really glad and thank you for inviting me here to have that experience. I titled my talk as Behavior and Computation. That's what I see as the two driving forces that will define the future of mobility. So today's talk will start with the first part on urban mobility, then we'll touch a little bit about the evolution of the work into the future. Right? Throughout human history, we invented a fantastic set of technology that help us move from A to B. MIT actually contributed to many of them, or many of the components of those technologies. But have those technology progression translated into the betterment of the mobility system as a whole is a question mark. How many of you have been to China before? Raise your hand, a few. So that's what we'll see in Chinese cities, just like many of the big cities in the world. But I guess few of you would have been to China in the 1980s. How many of you actually been to China in the 1980s or even 90s? Oh, there are a few. Wow, that's great. So that's the same city 40 years ago. Right? So what do you see in this picture? Bicycles, pedestrians, public transit, electrified, right? How do you call this picture in this modern transportation planning jargon? We call this sustainable travel, low carbon travel, active travel, green travel, all the beautiful words we developed to describe this picture, right? While Beijing as a city, just like many cities in the world, strive themselves to move away from this picture back to this motorized system. Right? So I would say transportation as a profession, we're utterly confused. Right? In the 40 years, technology clearly improved, right? But are we designing or implementing a better system here, right? So that's a question I really like everybody to help think through. All right, so what will define urban mobility of the future? I would say behavior and computation are the two key drivers, right? So I will give a flavor of what do I mean by behavior thinking, and then introduce a little bit on the computational power, particularly the recent artificial intelligence development. And then lastly, I'll try to combine the two forces, bring the behavior and the computational thinking together to illustrate the power. All right, so when I say behavior thinking, what do I mean? Here are 3 questions I would like to ask. Is travel social? Is travel emotional? And is travel absolute? First of all, if you are trained, like me, in a classic transportation planning or engineering curriculum, these questions are utterly odd. You don't ask this question in transportation engineering or planning, right? But I argue that those are important factors that influence people's behavior, just as important as the infrastructure, as the railway, as the frequency, etc. Right? So I'll start with the time. In Newtonian physics, time is linear, one-directional, and absolute. Right? In transportation, we think of travel time as wasted, of net utility, and to be reduced. The entire transportation community, we think of time in this way. Yeah. I took this view for a long time until I saw this picture, thanks to Spain, the surrealist Salvador Dali. He has this picture to reject the notion of rigidity of time and space. Here, what does autonomous vehicle do? Right, there are many aspects. One important aspect is on safety, but now I'm looking at this from a user perspective. What does autonomous vehicle do to users? Right? What it does, it changes the way we perceive time. Yeah. If you can utilize time while you're traveling in an effective way, either in the productive way or entertaining way, you will have a different perception what time looks like. Right? In Singapore, we have a project called Future of Mobility. Many of our colleagues developed the machine, which is autonomous driving, and many of us work on how do people actually experience the machine. Right? You can use these type of technologies, like in your headset, heart rate sensor, or this galvanic skin response, roughly this measure of sweating, right? To really understand the emotional and physiological response when you are riding the autonomous vehicle. Oh, by the way, these are my families. Different people have a really different view about autonomous vehicle. When I told my son and daughter, this is geometry, that's such an interesting thing. When I called my mom back in China saying, oh, Mom, I'm going to autonomous vehicle, she said, what are you doing here? Don't go there, anywhere. So this is huge variation about the risk preference in terms of this new technology there. Right? So what you can do is you can observe how people experience and learn about this new technology. Right? But what's important really, after we understand that autonomous vehicle may change the way people perceive time, it may change our locational choice and travel behavior, and fundamentally changing the urban structure. I think that's actually the biggest impact that autonomous vehicle will have, beside the safety contribution if we get to there. All right, I want to give a last example about how we people perceive time here. Right, Maldives, I don't know many of you been there or not, is a tiny, tiny country in the Indian Ocean. If you can, let's see if you can see here, right here, right, this part, this Maldives. You couldn't see it in the map, in the typical, like a world map there. It's a bunch of small islands, right? When you go there is we flew from Singapore to Malé, the capital city, and you take a small plane to get to another island, just barely can land a plane, and you take a boat finally to get to the destination of this particular island, right? Once I get to the island, I suddenly find that this island have a different time from the capital city, Malé. Remember, this is a tiny, tiny country, right? You couldn't see it in the map, right? But how come we have a different time? So I asked the manager, I said, why this have a different time? What's wrong here? And he said, you know, Jinhua, in this island, what time it is entirely my discretion, right? So I said, wow, that's just this godlike power. You can just change the time like that, right? So I said, okay, I'm impressed you have the power, but why you do that? Why you have a different time than Malé, your capital city here? He said, you know, in this island, the most beautiful scene I can offer my guest is the sunrise in the morning, right? But for Westerners come to my island, the notion that you have to wake up at 6 o'clock, that's an impossible concept, right? So therefore I changed to 7, right? So that people can wake up and actually enjoy the view, right? This is the strongest example I've ever seen that anyone can just manipulate time to such a degree, right? Of course, in transportation, we can do many related matters on this. So we describe the artist's view of time, the Einstein's view of time, the psychologist's view of time, and transportation view of time. Yeah, there's different frameworks we can use to really conceptualize this construct. Let me also give a flavor of what do I mean by emotion here, right? Transportation, when first I learned it, I thought this is a very mechanical. It's a daily chore, right? I do this because I have to. What do you talk about, social or emotional? Right? But later, I really learned that transportation indeed carry with it a lot of emotional or social meaning in it, right? There's one concept we call car pride. We try to capture that when people buy a car, what's the value to people beyond the utility of moving from A to B? Right, this is what's going additional to the utilitarian view of transportation. Right? We actually ask this type. This is in the United States. People have a lot of either positive association with certain mode of travel and negative connection with certain other mode of travel. In European city, like particularly in Madrid, that's not the case. I'm so glad that's not the case. Right? But we actually did some study. This in Shanghai. We asked people. Would you buy a car if you don't need it to travel? We thought that's a bizarre question, right? Maybe a small amount of people would just say, yes, I do that. But half of people said yes, right? So clearly there's something more than using the car to travel here. Right? And you can ask a question like, I feel proud of owning my car, right? The majority of people, if you take strongly agree and partially agree, majority of people said yes. So car clearly is not just some mechanical process there, right? So later you can formalize this process. We borrowed a lot from the psychology to look at how you symbolize the idea of having a car. And if you symbolize, does this symbolization related to your identity or not, right? And if the two are consistent, that's car pride, right? But if the two are contradict to each other, that's car shame. I started the concept of car pride, but I do observe that in many European countries, car shame actually exists. Right? Also back to MIT, particularly your transportation professor teaching sustainable travel, if a student asks you, how do you come here today? And if you drove today, you feel really sad, very hard to answer the question to student, right? Feel really sorry about that. Why is that the case? Car shame. Right? I was asked this question like that. Then I said I did drive. And then quickly I was add, oh, I have a Prius plug-in I'm driving. Nobody asked me what car I drive, but why add that to it? We try to explain to the student on this. So that's some degree of car shame on this. All right. So if you measure this car pride as a concept, you'll find that it actually correlates with a lot of these travel behaviors, either the owning a car or, so if you have a higher pride as we measured, you're more likely to buy a car, you're more likely to buy a big and a luxury car, right? And also you use it more often, right? The external power we find of the car pride is actually as much as income, which we all know is one of the most fundamental drivers that lead to ownership and usage. Let me give you another opposite side of the story about buses. Here, I worked in London for 2 years. At that time, we heard about the quote that's about in the 1980s, right? It's actually misattributed to Lady Margaret Thatcher. Said a man who beyond the age of 26 finds himself on a bus can count himself a failure. Right? So you really cannot be more emotional than this, right? Here, if a transportation modeler try to predict the probability of people choosing bus or choosing car or bicycle using this travel time, travel cost, and calculated probability, you'll entirely miss the boat, right? Because if you believe that using the bus will be seen you're a failure in life, it doesn't matter travel cost, it doesn't matter. You're not going to do this. Yeah. So here, of course, such a dramatized situation. In the 80s, the transportation system was really bad. But things can change. Right? When I was working there, that's in 2006 and 2007, I find everybody, rich and poor, black and white, old or young, use public transit without worrying on your social image being distant. In fact, in 2008, the mayor of London actually sent the bus to Beijing to receive the 2012 Olympic flag. So the bus changing from being seen as a failure to the pride of the city. Right? So the question is travel just a mundane chore, or does it have some higher meaning attached to it? Right? In fact, if you observe your life, any aspect of life, your food, clothing, your housing, your travel, each one of them have an element of utility and has an element of vanity. Right? The second part, I think we really need to pay attention to and understand. Last year, we also did an international comparison. We had the luxury of collecting this data across about 50 different countries. We measured the car pride, and here's the result. So in this chart, the top referring to a high car pride, the bottom is referred to the low car pride. Right? First of all, if you look at which countries have a higher car pride, they are Kenya, UAE, India, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, Egypt, etc. Right? To this side, the countries have a lower car pride. They are Japan, Ukraine, France, Greece, Chile, Australia, Spain is about here. Right? So in general, there's a pattern here. The dark dot represents the developed country. Developed country, in general, have a lower car pride, except United States here. That's United States has quite high on this. Right? The second one, for the country that's developing country, which have high car pride, you have a high desire to have a car. But because the economy has not developed much, people cannot afford it. So this desire has been compressed. Right? So in the next 10 or 20 years, we hope that their economy will grow, income will increase, then this type of compressed desire will exhibit itself. So that may lead to a lot more car ownership that we understood today. All right. So here, finally, I would just mention that from the behavior side, every organization, right, either a company or a foundation or government, you exist to change someone's behavior. Right? So when you define yourself, you should really look at what I'm doing every day, whose behavior I'm trying to change. Right? If you couldn't find that, your organization shouldn't exist. Right? Here, of course, in transportation, the whole set of business decisions related to transportation. Zhao mentioned the range anxiety issue. Yeah, you can translate these type of questions into a set of behavior questions, right, that help inform your decision making. All right. So second, I want to give a sense about this computational thinking, right? What has been happening here with today the new data, new algorithm, new computing power? We can do many things, right? You can represent things differently, predict, explain, etc. For now, just focus a little bit on prediction. Here, let me just give you a hypothetical question. Suppose we could predict one's travel behavior tomorrow precisely today. Right? We know exactly every single person in Madrid will do tomorrow. Right? How would we run the transportation system differently? Right? Here, let me give you an analogy in the e-commerce context. For example, Amazon. Right? If Amazon can predict when are you going to buy anything precisely, how would they change their business model? If for now, you go to the website, you type in, I want this towel, I want this shirt, or whatever, and they receive your request, then put in a package and send to you, right? But if Amazon can predict your consumption behavior precisely, they can just send the boxes to you without you asking at all why you have to go to the website. I know you very well enough. I know that 3 days from now, you probably need this. I'll just send it to you, right? Is it good or bad? It's another thing, right? I'm just saying that they have the capacity to do so if that's the case. Yeah. And for the time that they predicted wrong, they should return the box to you, right? They don't do that today because the prediction accuracy is not as high as necessary. Yeah. But in transportation, what can happen? Here in London, we did some experiment asking this exact question, right? If you observe one's travel history, can you predict the next trip in the bundle of travel time, origin, and destination? So if you're a Londoner, in the morning you wake up, you decide, do I travel today or not? And what time do I travel? From where and to where? Right? This is quite a complex behavior chain, but it turns out that you can do quite a bit of interim prediction. This is kind of a summary of the travel pattern. Without explaining the legend, you can already see there's a lot of irregularity in person's life. right? Based on the regularity, you can actually predict quite a bit, right? We are using an n-gram model, that's a natural language model borrowed into transportation, and you can predict to see an origin about 90%, destination 80%, departure time 70%, to quite a high degree, not 100% clearly, but that's what this type of technology allows us to do. So without getting into the specific methodology, I want to give a sense of how to utilize history, right? When all this fancy model, how do you utilize history? The first thing I would say is, it's amazing how history repeats itself. So what it means is just a simple average does a pretty good job in many occasions, right? But secondly, that you may be smarter in that you only find the history that's most similar to today or tomorrow. You find the relative history. You summarize them, average them to the prediction. So that's the second thing, right? So many of these fancy algorithms behind is trying to find out what do you mean by similarity? Yeah, how do I find the subset of history that's relevant today, right? The third part is that even though the entire history as a whole does not repeat precisely, but the component of them all exist. In many ways, the history is kind of a rebundling of those components, right? So many of the technology help you how to redesign, reorganize this component and use that to predict history data, right? Here, what I just said is when history is in the stable period. If I talk about pattern change, sudden pattern change, none of this works. And similarly, whatever fancy mathematical model wouldn't work if there's a pattern change in this. All right. Move on to, when we'll just illustrate a little bit on the behavior side and computation side. Now I'll give a few flavor of how to combine the two, right? I'll start with the first one in the decarbonization world. In terms of, when we see climate change, we all think, well, who should do anything about it? We should think, oh, the government should do something about it. The big corporation should do something about it. But my view is every one of us should do something about it. Every single citizen should think about this today, what can I do exactly, right? So here, we want to really empower the individual people's action in this, right? So let me ask you kind of a testing question. What do you have for lunch or dinner last night? Just an thought experiment, right? I like every one of you actually think about this, right? Is it beef or, noodles or whatever you got, right? And how much time does it take you? 20 minutes, 40 minutes, right? How much money it costs you, right? In a fancy restaurant or your home cooking, whatever, you have a number, like a 10 euro, 2 euro, whatever. I'll ask you, how much carbon does that dinner embody, right? You'll find most of us can answer the first question very easily, but have no clue about the third one. Right? So why that's the case, right? We are not born to understand time. We're not born to understand money. We're not born to understand carbon. But somehow we acquired the knowledge of our time and money, but we didn't acquire anything about carbon. Just if you're interested, the order of magnitudes is kind of a kilogram level, like between 1 kilogram to 5 to 10, roughly in that range, depending on vegetarian or the animal base, etc. Right? But here, the point is, the society is construed in such a way that we have a precise accounting of time and precise counting of money for almost all activity we do, all activities. You think about it, you buy a jacket, you go see a movie, every single one of them, right? But we do not have carbon. So my call for action is we really want to treat money, time, and carbon as the 3 fundamental units for any activities across the board. Only in this way, we can translate this national carbon commitment, yeah, every single country has some sort of a commitment, to the action that each individual citizen can do. Yeah. Last week, we had a conference at MIT. One of the audience come out, asked me a question. Say, Jinhua, if I have a blank check for you, right? What can you do at MIT campus? Just change the MIT campus. I said, if you have that, I want all the students and the faculty, when they do anything in the campus, they just buy a lunch, etc., you can simply pop up and say, oh, this is 2.5 kilogram you just used. This one is 1.0 kilogram. Every single one of them has this. I think that will be the foundation for us to actually take any action towards addressing the problem. So we have a startup company designated to that. You try to empower everyone to reduce the carbon footprint, but starting by at least be aware, be measuring the carbon emission of oil activities, and offer you meaningful choices that if you take option A versus choice B, this is 5 kilograms, this is 2 kilograms, and you make a meaningful choice here. All right, let me take a second example. I mentioned about the future of work here, right? How the travel behavior pattern will evolve, very much depending on how we conduct our activity in the city. If I ask, what is a job? It's very hard to answer questions sometimes, if you think about this. But I'd like you, how do you think of a job, right? In the most material sense is labor for money, right? Have to make a living. But most of us, I think, quickly to recognize there's a lot more than this, right? Having a job is where you acquire meaning, right? Having a job is how you identify yourself, right? So these are important functions of having a job that many of the future trends will challenge, right? And also more physically, each of the job comes with it a defined temporal, spatial, and organizational structure. For example, before COVID, I will say every morning, I will, at 9 o'clock, will go to Cambridge, Massachusetts, into building 9 at MIT, work with the 5 students I have, right? So time, space, and organization, I have a defined structure there, right? So job is an anchor that gives you the economic stability, give you the social identity, and also physically embed you in the city, right? But I argue that this anchor is shaking, right? Along all three dimensions, right? What do I mean? Here's with Nick Harris, one of my students. We're looking at, this is in collaboration with Stanford University. We'll look at, on average, across the board of the United States, what is the degree of remote working and how it's evolving, right? Before COVID, about 5% of time is actually conducted remotely, right? That's before COVID. And during COVID, it shot up to 60%, right? Very quickly, almost immediately, right? But then it's going down, and in the last year or so, it started to stabilize around about 40%. 40% time remote work, that roughly translates to 2 days a week you work at home, right? And that's up to, this is 39, that's reviewed behavior. So that's, as of now, what do you do, right? We also ask a question, which is a hypothetical one, saying, what's your future scenario, right? After the whole thing's gone, what the future expectation is about 30% on that. Even if you take the 30%, that's a 6-fold of an increase of remote working. That has a massive impact on how we travel in the city, and how do we run trains, buses, how do we design infrastructure, etc. And then, not only that's a general pattern, we also observe that there's an important tension between the employees and the employers, right? The rough story is the bosses want to say, oh, everybody come to office, work. And the employee said, no, I don't want to go back. I enjoy working at home, right? Particularly the one with, say, children at home or senior people need to take care, et cetera. They really find that work home beneficial. This tension is represented by these 2 curves. This is the employee plan, and this is the worker's preference. There's a huge gap between the 2, right? Almost every companies that we encountered are struggling with this tension, right? And try to figure out what do we do. This tension over the time, over the last 2 years, has been shrinking in the way that the employee preference is rather stable, is the employers kind of try to adapt to the reality and try to more comply with the employee preference there. There's also obviously important variation across industries, depending on the nature of the job, right? So for example, if you are a hair cutter, you need to go there and physically cut people's hair, right? Then you need to go physically, right? Versus if you are a digital publisher, and you can just work on the computer. So you'll find there's a huge variation between, say, transportation and warehousing is pretty to the low side of the flexible work. Then hospitality, food service, restaurant, right? Versus information, publishing, and media is very much to the right side. A lot more on the preference of the remote work. So really, if you want to understand the travel pattern change in a precise way, you have to go down to each of the industry, look at the specific patterns of their work and life schedule in this. The other thing we find is not when we see remote work, at the beginning we thought it's a binary notion, you work at home or work at office. But later we find that there's actually a variety of choices people make. Besides working from home, there's a lot of people work what we call these service places, right? Being in the public libraries, community centers, Starbucks coffees, co-working space, a friend's home. So this variety of destination choice becomes relevant here, right? So for a long time, when we talk about work trip, we don't ask the question of destination choice because destination is fixed. You go to MIT, I go to MIT, I don't have a choice. But today, actually, many people start to make these meaningful choices. It becomes much more complex and diverse patterns of travel that we need to understand. All right, so not only there's the physical thing, I also mentioned there's a strong meaning and identity associated with a job. We also observed that how one identify oneself start to evolve. Previously, we say, I work for a company, like General Electric or New Balance or any these specific companies, right? Later, we start to say, no, I work for industry because who knows, tomorrow I may work for another company, right? Then finally, we might I work in this profession, right? I can work in any industry who can use me on this profession, right? And more, some people will say, I'm just myself, right? Don't define me as any industry or company. I can work for, I have the entire freedom of what to do, right? So here, this notion of this anchor, job as anchor being shaken is not only in the physical, but also in the social sense here. All right, so what this means is now you have the temporal flexibility, you have the spatial flexibility, you can also have the organizational flexibility. So if you recombine these three dimensions, you can generate a variety of possible work life arrangement, right? So many of the traditional transportation planning concept and notion and structure really need to open up to accommodate all these possibilities there, right? And finally, I would just say that the people who study transportation, who typically in the civil engineering department, in the urban planning department, versus people who study organizational behavior, typically in the business school, management school, etc. We rarely talk to each other for a long time, which think this is your business, this is my business. But now I argue in order to understand the future work's impact on transportation and urban mobility, we really have to work together to do this. Okay. All right, the second aspect I also want to mention is a project that we just started with Singapore. It's on how AIs empower industries, institutions, and cities there. For that, if, I don't know, you guys familiar with the men's and manners, that's the motto of MIT, mind and hand. So hand and brain should work together, right? We'll put another one, which is machine, right? What do we mean by that? If you look at any culture, any society, we developed all sorts of institutions to help coordinate between people. Yeah, say, Jose and me, how do we work together, right? We have some structure, right? You and your student, you and your employee, you and your investor. We have all sorts of structure that guide us how to interact between people. Either market, religion, government, they all sort of organizations help organize us, right? But we haven't learned too much about how we're going to organize between a person and a machine, right? How to build a team that brings the power of the people and the machine together, right? So that's the question we try to ask. Right? In this, the general trend, there are two important ones. One is kind of technology and economic trend. These are the robotics and AI, the ICT, information communication technology, together with this augmented reality and virtual reality, which really try to change the notion of geography here, right? And the third one is more of a business change about the gig economy, this part-time individual contractor, right? So those are one type of trend. But there's also come with it a lot of social and institutional concerns, because all these technologies really are changing the availability of the job, the composition of the job, and distribution of the job. Right? Where the jobs are, what's the new definition of a job? Yes. Right. Here, there are several concerns I want to mention. One is the displacement of human jobs. Right? That's the obvious one. So that requires can we train people in a different way, or continue to train them to deal with a different type of requirement. The second one is the technology development in the academics versus in the industry. How do we exchange different ideas on this, right? The last one is, we just noticed, we actually had a good conversation with the new president from MIT, Sally Kornblas, that we have an observation that the new technology that MIT is developing, like quantum computing, genetic editing, blockchain technologies, AI, etc. The more they're developed, the general public, if you talk to someone on the street, they feel disconnected entirely from what MIT is talking about, right? The more advanced the technology, the more I feel like I have nothing to do with them. It's entirely irrelevant, right? This is a very dangerous trend. We actually find that it's an important responsibility for MIT not only to training the elite student, but also have a duty to inform the general public so that the public can understand the technology and understand its implication and be prepared for it. Right? So based on this, we will try to study the technological trend, the relational, institutional, and the physical impacts of those trends. Right? Specifically, we have two questions that we want to ask. The first one is the relation between human and machine, particularly in the sense that how do we train the workers so that they understand the latest progress in robotics and in different neural network, in AI in general. But also from the other side, how do we enhance the machines so that they can understand humans' intention, right? Machine can be powerful, but they do not have a purpose, right? They need to understand what purpose the people want here. That's this part. And the second question is how do we design the institutions, both the government, the business, the legal sectors, how to enable and protect this process. All right. So here, lastly, I want to give you a sense of this, how this behavior type of thinking and the machine learning trend really can relate to each other, right? Here, we have kind of two schools of thoughts often. One school of thought is these domain-specific models and theories, be it transportation, biology, chemistry. We developed decades, if not centuries of theories on this, right? The other side is this pure data-driven pattern recognition processes of this, right? Now, there's quite a tension between the two in the following sense. For now, we'll find in many areas, the prediction power from machine learning model can indeed be stronger than domain-specific models. We encounter several such examples. This, right? That's a few years ago, UC Berkeley organized a workshop. We invited a group of transportation scholars and a group of computer scientists together. We had a workshop, right? This one computer scientist come to me saying, Jinhua, you know, I never learned transportation. I don't understand any of your theories. It's just my model predicts better than yours, right? It's very challenging kind of reality you have to deal with. And this is true, again, cross domains. Many of the engineering field encountering these situations there, right? But of course, so what are the domain-specific model are powerful at? One is its interpretation. Interpretation the word itself have multiple interpretations. That's a lot complex to debunk this. But here I want to mention one thing. As transportation planners, the model have really two different roles. The first role is really get the number out, and so therefore we can build infrastructures, roads accordingly. But the other one, this transportation planning requires a communicative function, meaning as a transportation planner, you need to explain to the public, explain to the decision makers what's going on here, why you reach such conclusion. Without interoperability, this entire communicational function is destroyed, right? And now it's not only it's hard to explain to the public, sometimes the designer of this machine learning model is themselves, or me included in many cases, do not understand what's exactly going on in the model, right? That's even more dangerous notion of the interoperability. The next one is robustness. That's to say that if the system is receiving a certain kind of random shock, can you resist that a certain small shock will collapse the whole system here, right? That's where the domain-based model has a lot of advantage. Of course, these days, the two sides are recognizing each other's value. There's a lot of collaboration between the two and try to develop the synergy between the domain and the specific. Here's some example of how this in the discrete choice modeling framework and machine learning framework, how do we really integrate the two so that you both have the higher predictability, but also higher interpretability. Yes. All right, so in a way, the theory provides the general structure, the big structure, while machine learning can add a lot of local details to that. Right? So in terms of this behavior perspective of artificial intelligence, I want to mention this framework by Professor Dan Kahneman, mentioned that when we make a decision, right, we think we are making this conscious decision, like the top, right? But actually, much of our decisions are made subconsciously. Yeah. Subconscious meaning you don't have access to it. So therefore, as a researcher, we develop models, develop theories based on what we can access, the conscious part. So for a long time, we have no recognition of this part of that, right? But more and more now, we recognize that's actually the important aspect of our decision making that we do not have a conscious control of, right? So here, from the artificial intelligence development point of view, for a long time, we took the view of this so-called system 2, this conscious part, that you're using symbolic logic. So if A is true, then do B, this type of logic, right? In the last, I would say, 10 years or so, we start to use this system 1 level. It's just a bunch of data, put it together, finding patterns of each other. And all we believe that in the future, we really have to bring the two together to have a more both interpretable and powerful model. Right. Lastly, maybe I'll leave you with this, is back to how do we look at cities, right? The audience here, the fact you come to this lecture probably are interested in cities in different ways, right? Here, you know, from the academic point of view, there's really many different ways of describing cities, right? I put them into 4 different quadrants here, right? There's one group of people, they describe cities using images, right? Your urban designers, your artists. You know, when you look at city, how do you describe the city? You show a picture, right? That's one group, right? There's another group that, like anthropologists, historians, sociologists, when you describe city, how do you describe Madrid? They send you a novel, right? They give you a history book. They're using natural language to describe cities. Another type, they use numbers, right? Statistician, economists, they say the GDP is this, the population density is this, they use numbers. And another group use graphs, like transportation. We show you a road network, right? That's how we look at cities. Right? For a long time, you find these 4, we kind of talk across each other, right? Even in my own Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, you'll find people have a different training, right? The historians, the designers, the engineers, the transportation people, we kind of know roughly what exactly it means, but we really don't have a universal language to talk to each other, right? So it's really remain fragmented, right? But here, it's like in this plateau, when every one of us observing reality with one-dimensional projection, right? We see this particular angle. That's how I see transportation, or how I see cities, right? An urban designer will look at city in another projection, and a historian with another projection here, right? Very single-channel view here. But here, we see, for example, this is in Chicago. Right? Someone will describe Chicago, oh, has this amount of population, what's the car ownership, etc. Someone will say, oh, I will show you this is the road network for Chicago, right? And this one is saying, oh, this is the picture of Chicago. And the other one says, oh, this is a bunch of social media comments about Chicago, right? So you find that not only the theory are different, we use different data, right? We mean really different things when we say data, when we all study city as the same object, right? But now, we argue that, this is actually with Dr. Shenhao Wang, a prior MIT alum, we argue that this deep neural network has the potential of unifying the 4. To say when you predict something, like a car ownership, like this Y, in addition to put this numerical number X, right, you can include this as a function in the general sense, right? It's a function of these numbers, images, languages, and graphs to unify them, right? And nowadays, the deep neural network researcher has the capacity to digest images, digest languages in a way that's consistent with our prior discussion. Right. Okay, so with that, you can have a multi-channel view of cities. this, right? Hopefully then, or the different disciplines of city scholars, urban scholars can really understand and communicate with each other. All right, so I just described 3 things, right? And my own research is try to bring the behavior science and transportation technology together, right? But bring them together to do 3 things: to shape behavior, to design more interesting transportation system, and to reform policies. Right? In a way, the behavior thinking help us identify the opportunities, and computational thinking enable us to offer solutions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jinhua. Tenemos 5 minutos para preguntas. ¿Alguna pregunta? Ahí hay una pregunta. Oh, ok, está bien. Y después ahí.
¿Yo? Do you think a city without cars can exist? Like where everyone...
It does exist. Some of the cities, they're mostly small for that, don't have cars. Some of them are just saying this is a car-free city. But for most cities, car will exist in the appropriate context there, right? Madrid, for example, for us coming from the United States, look at Madrid, look at Barcelona. We already think that's much pedestrian-friendly, much public transit-friendly cities there. But doesn't mean that you get rid of all the cars, right? The car has certain context, it's very important, right? You cannot, for example, for public transit to work, you need enough density of population, right, to support it, right? But you cannot force everybody to leave this high-density human settlement, right? There are occasions people want to enjoy more low density, closer to the nature. These cases, car will be important, right? Bicycle and walking are important, are nice. We actually had this conversation before. We asked these guys saying, why you don't bike, right? The response is, if I can afford living in this downtown close to my job, of course I will bike and walk, but I couldn't afford it. So I live like 20 miles away where there's no good public transit. Then as an individual, we cannot change the structure. So that's, but collectively, how do we build the city? That's we have a human agency. We can do something different on this.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. So basically, we as urban planners, what we try to do is to foster a more sustainable mobility. And what I understood behind what you said is that, I mean, most of the decisions are really difficult to discourage. We planners tend to understand things using very straightforward parameters, such as travel time and the age, etc. But there are aspects which are cultural, which are maybe psychological, which depend on tradition, what you have been doing. So my impression, and it was very interesting what you said, is that with the current tools of machine learning, artificial intelligence, we can use quite a lot of data to come up with that. No? And yes. I fully agree with that. But my question to me is, it appears to me that one of the most difficult, to have models, we need data. And it is clear that we have quite a lot of data nowadays. But the most difficult data is precisely what lies in your brain, no? Your traditions, your culture. So my question to you is, how do you think we will be able to get this data to incorporate in the models? No? More things that are really difficult to know on the basis of what you are doing, or the maps, or the pictures, or other things. No?
That's a great question. I will start with that. So in this urban planning profession or academic, right, we often have really 2 schools of practices. One school is this engineering approach, right? We treat a city just like we treat a machine. We sense things, we model things, we quantify, build this mathematical model, try to estimate, predict, optimize. That's one group, right? Many of my colleagues, like in this group as well, myself included. Then there's another group saying that city is chaotic. We cannot, we actually don't want to be quantified, right? We like this some degree of messiness, right? And for this group of people, they have a lot of experience and intuition, right? I've been observing in Madrid for 30 years. I know where the pain point is, even though I cannot put a number onto this, but I know that's the problem here. I understand the local context here. What I'm suggesting is, with the new technology, we have the potential to engage the two sides, right? Here, what I just said about what is data, right? So for example, if there's, say, 20 important books about Madrid history, it's already written there, right? For a model that try to monitor and predict the future of Madrid, they cannot engage these 20 historical books, right? A human can, an experienced planner can, right? But here, I'm asking a question is, can we really absorb the insight of these books or of these pictures, of these paintings into a digestible form that mathematics can engage, right? This is a potential. We have some limited attempt to that. For example, we've been working on how to use the satellite image or how to use the road network graphics to really understand people's travel behavior. It's a limited attempt to that, right? But more and more, I think we'll try to have a deeper understanding of the city. When we see a planet has this intuition, what do we mean, right? Can we really represent those intuitions in an explicit way that then we can engage the mathematical model there, right? So that's a version of that, right? And also, this notion may be rejected by many of my colleagues. They may say, Jinhua, this whole attempt I just reject fundamentally. I don't want you to come here with deep neural network try to quantify my intuition. My intuition is mine, right? There's a lot of like attention in this area as well.
Okay. Muchas gracias, profesor Zhao. Thank you. Tenemos un receso de 30 minutos. Por favor, estén de vuelta a las 6:15. Arrancamos con la presentación del doctor Florian Allroggen sobre creando un futuro sostenible para la aviación, que es un tópico muy importante. Así que los espero en un poquito menos de 30 minutos. Gracias. Bueno, vamos a continuar, y bien nos sentemos. Vamos a continuar con el tercer ponente de la tarde. El doctor Florian Allroggen es investigador científico en el Departamento de Aeronáutica y Astronáutica del MIT y director ejecutivo del Departamento de Clima y Sostenibilidad Aeroespacial. Él también codirige el Laboratorio de Aviación y Medio Ambiente del MIT y los esfuerzos de descarbonización del transporte en el Consorcio de Clima y Sostenibilidad del MIT. Además, el director ejecutivo de la Alianza de Aviación de Impacto Cero del MIT. Su ponencia, Creando un futuro sostenible para la aviación. Doctor.
Thank you, Eduardo. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think they put a special challenge on for me so that I don't trip over those chairs. I'll do my best, and if it's entertainment for you, so that's okay. Yeah, good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation to ILP and the Fundación and for putting this on. And I'd actually like to change the play a little bit. We've been on the ground quite a bit, and being on the ground is bad for aircraft, right? They need to fly. So I'm going to take you up into the air. And I'd like to talk about another part of the future of mobility, which is how can we actually fly sustainably? And can we do that in the future? But before I get there, let me start actually by asking you all a question. Who of you has actually taken a flight in the last 6 months? Lift your hand. That's great. That's almost everyone. It's good. Leave it up. Leave it up. Leave it up. Okay. Who of you would say, from those of you who flew, that that flight wasn't needed and was just a waste of time? If so, take your hand down. Otherwise, leave it up. You all left your hand up. Great. That's what I thought. We fly for a reason, right? Aviation is a fast means of transportation. Jinhua talked a lot about time. That's why we fly, right? We can get somewhere fast. And especially if it's intercontinental, there's not much of a substitute to fly. Well, if I was flying, I wouldn't be here today. I would still sit on a ship. I would have missed my talk. So I needed this very clearly. The second point is aviation has become available all over the globe. Here I put on a map for you, a map that actually shows you how well each point of the globe is connected through the air transportation network. On the top, you see connections made through direct flights. On the bottom, you see connections that are made through indirect flights. So you fly through a hub and you change your plane. And basically what you see over time, the world over the last 20 years has become a lot more connected. And if you look at sort of the development over time, you see first sort of, a lot of the development in the 1990s in Europe, and then you see Asia rising. You see how remote places really benefit from the networks and from the indirect connectivity, which is really interesting. So that's the trends that we have. And we fly for a reason. That is very important to realize. We don't fly for the fun of it. Well, geeks like me fly for the fun of it. I do love flying, so I like getting on airplanes. But most of you probably fly because there are economic reasons behind it, right? You want to meet your business partners and want to make investments and want to trade with other people, innovation and all these things that are related to that. There may be cultural reasons, right? My parents-in-law just flew to Amsterdam because they wanted to see this wonderful Vermeer show that they put on there, right? A once-in-a-lifetime experience, like cultural reasons, societal reasons. I'm from Germany, right? So I fly home 3 times a year to see my parents. That's what I promised them when I went to the US. I said, I'm coming home 3 times a year. So that's my promise to my mother. Societal benefits. So there's a downside to all of this. Aviation comes with emissions. Here's a breakdown of the aviation emissions. You see, a lot of the aviation emissions are actually CO2 emissions. No surprise there, right? We burn a hydrocarbon fuel, hydrogen and carbon, and what comes out is CO2. There's quite a bit of water in the exhaust of an aircraft. And then there is a lot of other stuff in there, like NOx and SOx and hydrocarbons and black carbons and organic carbons. That's all fine. But all of this has impacts. And that is something that we really need to talk about. And the first, well, there's one more thing, obviously, on emissions, noise. If you live close to an airport, that's the biggest community concern that we have, right? Noise. And that's really what's hampering us in building the infrastructure that we actually need to serve aviation. But let's put that aside for a little bit. That's a slightly different problem. We can deal with that as well, but for today, let's put that aside. But all of this has impacts. The first category of impacts that I'd like to talk about are climate impacts. So basically, we have these emissions, and how do they actually affect climate change? Well, how do they do that? Well, the first kind of effect is CO2. We are all very well aware of the greenhouse gas effect of CO2, so no surprise there. The second one that I want to mention to you is the impact of contrails, these white, tiny, line-shaped clouds that you see behind aircraft. They're not chemtrails. Chemtrails don't exist. They're contrails. And this is pure ice. It's not exhaust or something like this. This is actually an ice cloud. How does it form? Well, in a pretty cold environment, you emit some water that's actually warm. The environment is cold. What happens? The water freezes on particles in the exhaust. There you are. That's your ice cloud. In most situations, it looks like in this picture there, right? You look up, and you probably all have looked up and looked at contrails. I've looked up at contrails a lot, so it really hurts after a while, so don't do it. Most of the time, the contrail appears pretty much right away. Actually, we're not so worried about that situation. But in many other situations, it looks like this. The plane is long gone, but the contrail is still there. That's where it becomes a problem. And it gets even worse. These contrails can persist for hours. And they can actually look like something like this, where it's like, is this really a contrail? This almost certainly is one. But it looks like a cirrus cloud, like a normal cloud. That's really where we have the problems. And why do we have a problem? Because we do form these contrails a lot. And the problem is that what we know about contrails today, we mostly know from models. We actually don't know how good they are. So what we've done at MIT is actually take a different approach. We're like, well, let's train a computer to look at satellite images and find contrails, and actually create an inventory of years' worth of contrails over the US. Here's the result. This average contrail coverage over the US in 2018 and 2019. So you see, they pretty much form in the entire US airspace. This algorithm didn't know anything about air routes. You see air routes, right? East Coast to the Caribbean, all of this kind of stuff here. That's good. So that gives us a lot of confidence that this is pretty real. You also see, for example, close to Miami, the contrails disappear. Why? Because a lot of the aircraft, their descent, the air is warmer. Nothing freezes in your exhaust, so you don't make a contrail. So this is a widespread phenomenon. And I told you, we mostly have to worry about the persistent ones. Why? This is because how does actually a contrail affect our atmosphere? In two ways. So you have an airplane, it makes a contrail. The first thing that a contrail does, like a normal cloud, is it shades the globe. It basically reflects out incoming sunlight. That obviously only happens during the day, and it's obviously a cooling effect. So that's good, right? The story continues. What it also does, a cloud, is it's a layer around our atmosphere. It traps outgoing heat. So that's a warming effect. So basically, the net effect of a contrail is the balance of these two effects. And the net effect is going to be heavily situational. During the night, a contrail is almost certainly always warming because the reflection effect isn't there. There's no sunlight. During the day, it can be warming, it can be cooling. It's difficult. So most of the time, and if you look into the science, we kind of know that the net effect, that's the consensus at this point, is that contrails are warming on net. There are more climate impacts of these emissions, but most of them don't really matter much. I'll talk about that in a second. So let's not get hung up on that. The second category that we need to talk about as a result of these emissions is actually air pollution. So, and these mostly result from the NOx emissions of an aircraft. Historically, we've thought about that as a local problem. It's just like noise. The aircraft is close to the ground, it emits stuff, people breathe it, there you are, you have a health problem. This has changed. Over the last 10, 15 years, the research has shown that actually even the emissions at cruise altitude create an air pollution issue. How does this work? Well, you emit mostly NOx. This actually in the atmosphere leads to a formation of ozone on fine particulate matter. You breathe it in, on what the result is, and that's what the epidemiology shows us. It's a higher risk for cardiovascular disease, for respiratory diseases, and we can account for that. So these are the impacts that we need to worry about. But they're very different, right? We have the impacts of climate change from warming, so more natural disaster, yield implication for agriculture, health effects, you know the list. And the health impacts for air quality, well, it's purely health. Now, how can we add these things up to really sort of understand what the net effect of aviation is? One way we do this a lot in policy analysis, specifically in the US context, is monetize all of this. Put a dollar value to the climate damage from the warming of aviation. Put a dollar value to the air quality implications of aviation. You can do that. There are established methods for that. And that's what we did here. And we also normalized it and said, well, let's do this per ton of fuel emitted, because that's really useful. Because then you can say, okay, if I save a ton of fuel, I'll have an advantage from that. So here we go. Here are the climate impacts from aviation. Per ton of fuel, $585 of climate damage. Where do these effects come from? About 2/3 CO2, okay, not a surprise, and about 1/3 contrails. You'll see different values around the contrails. There's a lot of uncertainty in our understanding of contrails, but total number $585. That's 70% of the current price of jet fuel. And as an additional externality, as an environmental cost that we impose by burning a ton of jet fuel. And the story goes on. We put the air pollution on top. That's another $360. And if you would guess where this is coming from, 90% of that is from cruise emissions and not from the landing and takeoff cycle. The problem is we currently regulate aircraft on the landing and takeoff cycle, so take your conclusions from that. So ton of jet fuel, $840. Total external cost for the environment, $860. So it's pretty much the price of fuel, again, on top. That's the external cost of what we're doing there to the environment every day. Now we have a little bit of a conundrum as a result, right? We have seen all these important benefits, and I do not want to negate them. Like I strongly believe we need to fly. Our society wouldn't work without having aviation around. That's not the world that we want to live in, where we can't fly and see other cultures. I personally think there's a lot of benefit that we would lose if we wouldn't fly. So how do we deal with this? So now you could go into cost-benefit analysis and restrict air transportation, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's a useful discussion. I think the discussion that we should have should be this. Can we create a technically feasible and economically viable air transportation system that gets us all these wonderful benefits that I just talked about for the aviation sector, but does not come at this environmental cost? And my hypothesis for my talk is, yes, we can. And I'll show you how. And I'll start with a sort of very common aviation sector argument, which is, how do we solve the problem? Well, the best thing is not to burn fuel. So to basically produce the same amount of traffic and the same amount of service to the society while not burning fuel. Basically by increasing fuel efficiency. And the sector has done amazingly at that over the last 60 years. Look at this chart that I brought you. These are basically yearly improvements in the fuel burn per passenger transported for 1 mile. And you see it's sort of on the order of like not so much, but up to sort of something like 3%. Huge improvement first in the 1960s. That's high bypass ratio engines. That's the Boeing 747. And it kind of tapered out. Then in the 80s, there was a huge push from the new narrow bodies coming online. That's the Airbus A320. That's the 757 coming online, the Boeing 767. Then again, it tapered off a little bit. And then we see, again, a little bit of a push in new aircraft efficiency in the 2010s. That's through the A350 and the Boeing 787. So this is a success story, right? This is a reduction of fuel burn per passenger kilometer of 50% over 50 years. It's really important to realize. However, it's also important to realize that this strategy alone, and I emphasize alone, will not get us to the goal of net zero. Let's do a little bit of math. Fuel burn improvements, let's assume we get 2% per year between 2019 and 2050. And you see that's really aggressive based on historical data. Market growth, Boeing forecast right now says during this period is 3.8% per year, so the market will triple globally. Well, what's the net fuel burn effect of all of that? Plus 68%. So we can't even offset growth. So as much of a success story as this has been technologically, this alone is not going to get us there. We should, and you'll see that later, we have to take every little measure in efficiency improvement that we can get. It's going to get really important. But it's not going to solve the problem alone. So we have to go back to my plot, because it's not just fuel burn. We need to actually think about how we can strategically address each of these impact areas. So how are we going to do that? Well, three technologies that we need to combine. First, we need low carbon fuels that address the CO2 problem. Second, we need to not make contrails. You can do a lot of technical things, but you can also, and I'll show you that to you later, fly around the regions where contrails form and you will be pretty much fine. And third, what about the NOx? Well, we've dealt with NOx in power plants, we've dealt with NOx in cars. Why not do the same for airplanes? So let's talk about that. Three technologies. So let's start with the low carbon fuels. The reason why we need to talk about it is we burn a hydrocarbon fuel. By doing that, we release carbon from the geosphere into the atmosphere. That's our whole climate change issue. So we need to get away from that. How do we do that? Well, the first step we can take is we can take fuels that we call drop-in or at least near drop-in fuels. So they're basically also hydrocarbons. They're fuels that you can put into existing aircraft today. Where are these fuels coming from? Well, there's a lot of enthusiasm around this topic now. You'll see that labeled as sustainable aviation fuels. What you do is, instead of taking the carbon from the geosphere by drilling, you take it out of the biosphere. So you take biomass, you convert that into a biofuel, you burn that, you still have a CO2 emission, but that's not a problem because the carbon in the biosphere was recently sequestered into the biosphere through photosynthesis. Problem solved. So theoretically, this could be a zero carbon solution, right? There's a lot of enthusiasm around this right now. There's 3 points that I want to give you about this. Point number 1, as much as most people would love these fuels to be zero carbon fuels, they really aren't. Because we have to think about the system, we have to think about this holistically. We have to think about how these fuels are being made. We have to think about the land use that we have to change. We have to think about cultivating these plants, fertilizers, right? We have to think about transporting the feedstocks to a conversion facility where we then, out of the biomass, actually make a fuel, which is an incredibly energy-intensive process, right? Think about drying biomass, for example, and then making a long-chain hydrocarbon out of it. You need to transport then to the airport, and you need to fuel the aircraft. And if you do that, I brought you here 10 examples, I think, of different fuel pathways. And what I'm showing you here is the carbon intensity of the fuel. Basically, the grams of CO2 per unit of energy in the fuel. Here's the petroleum baseline. The petroleum baseline value is 89 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And you see some sustainable aviation fuels that actually have a worse impact than petroleum-derived fuels. So just saying, oh, I'm using a biomass-derived SAF is not telling you anything. Could actually make the situation worse. There are other fuels that have tremendous reductions, like, for example, this candidate here, really low carbon impact savings of like 80–90% in carbon savings. So the first thing to realize, for example, if your airline tells you that they use SAF, is you need to ask which one and what its carbon intensity actually was, because the marketing term sustainable aviation fuel is not going to tell you anything about that. Is it a 50% saving? Is it 100% saving? Is it 90% saving? There are methods to calculate that. They all know that. So that's the first point. Second point, this is going to cost money. It's not going to be cheaper than petroleum-derived fuels. Surprise, surprise, because pumping something out of the ground, doing relatively little to get it into the final product is a pretty straightforward process. This is much more involved. So a couple of cost estimates again. Forget about what these actual pathways are. It doesn't really matter. All I want to tell you is, if you compare this to current jet fuel prices, well, currently we're talking about 50% plus, and there are pathways where you have sort of a factor of 6. Don't worry, this factor of 6 fuel you couldn't buy right now. Nobody's doing that, right? This is purely sort of a techno-economic analysis. This 50% plus thing, that's actually produced. You can get that today. But these are what we call pioneer approaches, right? For plants that are not fully scaled up. We haven't yet learned how to actually produce these plants and make these fuels at scale. So what happens once we do that? Once we have learned how to do this? Well, the cost gap actually gets quite a bit smaller. There are fuels that will be within 10 to 20% of what jet fuel costs today. So the cost premium doesn't have to be that large. And that's very important to realize, but there is a cost premium. And someone's got to pay for it. Third point, as long as we talk about biomass-derived fuels, we need to think about where all this biomass is going to come from and how much we have. So enter the IPCC report. The IPCC report in the mitigation section actually put out some estimates. We actually recalculated that over the last year at MIT, and we came to pretty much the exact same numbers. Globally, we'll have between 55 and 300 exajoules per year in bioenergy. Up to 55 exajoules of that come from residues. So that's where your food residues is like your you know, the oil, the goop that sort of like comes from fries and, you know, slaughtering trash and all this kind of stuff. So that's the stuff that we get for free. That's where we all would love to focus our attention, right? Because it's literally reusing a waste. Up to 55 exajoules a year. If you add purpose-grown energy crops on top, another 50 to 250 exajoules a year. So that's where the big scalar is. And just, well, let's look at the numbers. Let's put these numbers in perspective. How much energy will we need for aviation? About, this IEA forecast says about 19 exajoules a year for 2050. I don't believe that. I think it's going to be more 25, but fine, 20, 25 exajoules. So you'd say, like, well, for aviation, this actually looks really good, right? Now add other heavy-duty transportation on top, and you're at 60 already. Now add additional demand on top from other biomass needs, like the chemical industry or bioenergy, et cetera, we'll have a pretty significantly higher demand there. Now enter one more problem. These two numbers are not directly comparable. What I have on top there is what we call primary bioenergy. You need to convert into the fuel, you lose about half that energy. So the 5 to 50 residues is more like 25 a year. So that's not even enough, may not even be enough for aviation alone. We can't just rely on residues. So I hope some EU policy maker hears that. So we have to continue in our journey for low carbon fuels. Power and biomass to liquid. I just said we lose a lot of energy. We also lose a lot of carbon in these processes. Can we recycle that carbon as we lose it? Yeah, we can. That's what power to biomass to liquid is. Just shoot hydrogen at it and make more hydrocarbons. Costs some money, but it really gets your yields up. Could be a solution to some of this factor 2 problem that I just talked about. Or just entirely take biomass out of the system and just take the carbon from the atmosphere through direct air capture, make hydrogen through electrolysis, synthesizes, make a fuel out of it. A lot of enthusiasm about that. Again, 3 points I want to give you. First thing is, there's a lot of potential. We can make a lot of this fuel if we want to. The only thing we really need is power generation, because this is a lot of energy. So per megajoule of fuel that you produce, you need something with future technology like 2.3 megajoules of electricity per megajoule of fuel. So it's a not great efficiency. And that's already future technology. Currently, that's way higher. But here's the good news. We can make this electricity. It's not a problem. Here's a cost supply curve for electricity, up to 200,000 terawatt hours a year globally. We took out like land, which is conservation land, where people live, like agricultural land, all this kind of stuff, all out. And we looked at the price of producing this electricity. This curve is flat. We can make 200,000 terawatt hours of renewable electricity, and it's just solar and wind on the planet, and there's almost no cost delta in that electricity. IEA says by 2050 in the net zero scenario, we need about 60,000 terawatt hours of renewable electricity. Let's take that out. Then if you put the PTL production from all of aviation on top, it doesn't really make a dent, right? And by the way, the 200,000 terawatt hours, that's not the total potential. That's literally where we cut off this figure. There's a lot more you can make. So if we want to, we can scale this. That's the good news. The bad news is it's still not a zero carbon fuel. A lot of people walk around and say it is zero carbon fuel. I don't think it is. Because we need to think about how we actually define the attributable emissions. And here we need a lot of power generation. So you need to build a lot of photovoltaic cells. You need a lot of wind power. And if you want to do that, that comes at an emissions footprint. I think you need to account for that. And by the way, if you want to make power to liquid fuels, you need enough catalysts, et cetera, they are also very carbon intensive. So you need to account for that. Once you do that, it's a pretty low carbon fuel, 6 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule, and this is purely for wind-driven system. It's quite a bit higher for a solar-driven system. So that's good. Where's this coming from? It's from the electricity, it's from the direct air capture unit that you need to build, from the processes you need to build, from the transportation. It's not zero, but it's a 93% reduction. So from that perspective, again, it's not that bad. Third point is this is really expensive. Right now, if you wanted to do this, about $3 a ton. A liter, sorry. Per ton would be golden. $3 a liter. Factor 5 to 6 over current fuel price. So that's tough, right? Consider typically 20% is the operating cost contribution of fuels to an airline, to the total airline cost. Factor 5 on that, you see what's happening. That's not easy to do for an airline. But the future gives us hope, because as we get more renewable, cheap renewable electricity, as we get cheaper CO2 capture, as we get better electrolyzers, this can come down quite a bit. And if you turn the assumptions a bit, you may come up with something like $1 to $1.20 per liter. Then we're in the game. Okay, so there's another scalar that we can do. At that point, you may ask the question, why do we even make drop-in fuels? Well, we need it for the current fleet, but going forward, why not build aircraft that don't need that? Why not a hydrogen aircraft, for example, doesn't have any direct carbon emissions? Isn't that a great solution? So, yeah, let's talk about that. Well, if you look at it from an energy perspective, purely from an energy perspective, how do you get the energy to the aircraft? I'm not yet talking about the aircraft, we'll come to that. Here's the picture that most people will actually talk about. Compare a power to liquid fuel per megajoule of energy that you bring on board the aircraft. You need, we talked about it, 2 to 3 megajoules. So efficiency 30 to 50% in conversion. If you do the same with liquid hydrogen, And it's liquid. There's a reason for that. We'll come to it. With the liquefaction, maybe 1.5, 1.8, depending what you believe about future technology. And this is electrolytic hydrogen. Okay, so here's your 40% advantage, right? So why shouldn't we do this? This is the main argument that people bring up when we talk about this hydrogen idea. I think there's two important things that we need to talk about when we bring this argument up. And the first one I'm really serious about because I think it's a major issue that people are overlooking, the logistics of this. The way the aviation sector is used to thinking about energy is energy shows up, you buy it, and it's at the airport. You don't worry about it. Right? It's slight simplification, but that's kind of it. So what's the equivalent of that for hydrogen? You make all of this off-site electrolysis, liquefaction. You bring the fuel in cryogenic state to the airport, and you fuel the aircraft. You can't pipeline it, so you need trucks, trains, or tanker ships. Just to give you a scale number, if you wanted to do this with Paris-Charles de Gaulle, and I'm not projecting traffic, I'm talking about 2019 traffic levels. How many trucks do you need per day? Wild guess. Anybody? No? It's 1,000. Quite a bit. Per day. Each day. So why not make this simpler? Just make gaseous hydrogen off-site and pipeline to the airport. Because gaseous hydrogen you can pipeline. Well, you can do that, but then you need to liquefy at the airport. That still is about 20% of your energy demand there total. So for Paris-Charles de Gaulle, that's a solar array of the size of the city of Paris. Again, 2019 traffic level. So at that point, you can basically ask yourself, why don't you do basically everything at the airport and just line electricity? And you know what? We did a study for every global airport. And what we find is for 95% of airports, that's the cheapest solution, despite the cost of the infrastructure. The problem then becomes space at the airport. So that's the first problem I'd like to talk about. There's a related challenge to this, and that's a cost challenge, is that the price of hydrogen that you actually get at an airport is not going to be homogeneous around the globe. It will depend heavily on what kind of electricity resource you actually have. So here's a global map of airports that we actually found. This is for 2050. And what you see if you just track the colors is that, the US is fine. There's not a super high price of hydrogen in the US. Europe would be fine. Africa would be fine. South America is fine. We really have a problem in Southeast Asia if you only use wind and solar, because you don't have a lot of land and you don't have the greatest wind and solar resource. So there you would that's actually where you find the airports where you don't line electricity, where you start to use tanker ships and bring it in from Australia, but it's just expensive. So that's the problem that we have. Second problem, we haven't talked about the aircraft itself, because now you have a fuel that you can't just put on board the aircraft, so now we have to redo the aircraft. Let's conceptually think about this for a second. And what helps us think about it is this plot. It's gravimetric energy density, it's sort of the amount of energy that you bring on board per kilogram of fuel that you load, and volumetric energy density, so the amount of energy per unit volume. And we start pretty far up there with jet fuel. Now, if we go to liquid hydrogen, or gaseous hydrogen, we go down in this plot. That means we decrease our volumetric energy density. So we need to bring more volume on board. So what does that mean? We need higher loading volume. You need to build a bigger aircraft. Bigger aircraft means more drag, and basically more structural weight. So that's a disadvantage of bringing hydrogen on board. And by the way, you now also already see why we wouldn't use gaseous hydrogen, because it's just a lot of volume. You can do this for smaller application, for regional flying, et cetera, et cetera. That's where this makes sense. But if you go to aviation as we know it today, longer distance, it's not going to work. So other dimension, the weight challenge. Well, the weight of hydrogen fuel is obviously lower, factor of 3 to 4. However, the advantage is not that large because now you need a cryogenic tank. And you know what that is? Heavy. So the overall balance for the aircraft is actually pretty simple. We need to trade off the lower fuel weight versus the penalty that comes with the structure of the aircraft, the cryogenic tank, and there may be some potential benefits that you actually get in the engines. Current literature consensus is we lose about 20% of energy efficiency. But there may be things to tweak that. So we went there, why not bring the electricity directly on board? We talked about batteries earlier. We're nowhere near anything that would give us a battery for airliner-sized aviation as we know it today. Yes, for smaller vehicles, you know, people call urban air mobility, drones, all this kind of stuff, even smaller regional flying, yes, sure. But that's not the bulk of aviation today, right? So for what we needed, we're very far off. And Don will work on it, hopefully, and solve the problem, and then we have it. No, he doesn't want to, I see it. So that's the fuel problem. A lot of different things we can do, and I don't think there's a single winner at this point. The only thing that's clear is in the medium term, we'll do sustainable aviation fuels. So that brings me to the contrail problem. I showed you this plot earlier, right? Average contrail coverage over the United States. If you look at that plot, you're like, well, how am I supposed to fly around contrail-forming region? They're everywhere. Well, the reality is that at a particular given moment in time, that is not the case. Because contrails only form if the conditions are right. It has to be sufficiently cold and sufficiently humid. If that's not the case, you don't get a contrail. Not every flight makes a contrail. It's actually only a small fraction of flights that make contrails. So here's a picture. This is our contrail detection algorithm. I prepared, obviously, last Sunday for this talk. This is from our MIT's contrail detection algorithm. These were live detections at that time of contrails from satellite imagery. And you see clusters of contrails, right? There's contrails down here, there's some here, there's some here, there's some in there in the St. Lawrence River. They're clustered. So at that point, you're like, well, can I fly around it? And you can do that in two ways, right? You can do it laterally, where you literally fly around it. You don't really want to do that. It's additional time. It's quite a bit of additional fuel burn. So that's pretty tough sell. But the other thing you can do is you can fly around it by adjusting the altitude. That's much better. Why? Because the regions in which contrails form, they tend to be really thin. There's not a lot of altitude adjustment you need to do. With 2,000 to 4,000 feet, you're usually in the clear. So that's good. That means that your fuel burn penalty of that is not going to be super high. But there is going to be a fuel burn penalty, because usually an aircraft flies pretty much as high as it can, because that's most fuel efficient. And you'll usually fly under it. There's some edge cases where you fly over because of wind, but different story. So we have additional fuel burn. We need to weigh the additional fuel burn against the contrail benefit, right? So how does that look? So we did this global study on this, all global flights, only narrow bodies in this case, and asked ourselves, how much fuel burn do we need? So x-axis, additional fuel burn. Y-axis, how much of my contrails can I avoid? Let's go to the exact end of this curve. All the flights that I have to reroute, 1.4% of fuel burn penalty for reducing about 98% of contrail length. And actually, because I don't touch every flight, if I put this on the entire fleet, it's only about 0.5% of additional fuel burn for basically reducing all contrails. Remember the split in climate impact? 1/3 contrails, 2/3 CO2. 1% fuel burn means, 0.5% of fuel burn means 0.5% of CO2 more versus 30% down. So even if we're off by quite a bit of a factor, this is a beneficial strategy. Okay, so we can do this, and to be honest, we're trying it, right? We have a partner with Delta Airlines in the US. They basically are doing this with us right now, and we are observing the outcomes using our satellite products that we have. And this is like live imagery. Every 5-10 minutes, we create these coverage maps. And we have a tool, and you can go online and look at that. Okay, so NOx, our last problem. How have we dealt with NOx in other sectors? Well, if you ever want to crawl under your car, you'll find a catalytic converter. If you look at a power station, you find these weird buckets on the side. It's basically a scaled-up version of the same thing. Basically, what happens is there's a chemical process going on there. NOx goes in, nitrogen comes out with some water. Right? There's ammonia in this and all this kind of stuff. So we know this technology, it works. Why can't we do it on an airplane? Well, historically, that was simply impossible because the fraction of sort of the thrust, the power forward that you give the airplane that came from the exhaust stream of the airplane was way too high. With a modern gas turbine, that is not the case anymore. So you can actually put such a device behind it, and it's not going to kill you. The only problem is that the device is going to be large. So you don't want to do this under the wing. It's way too much drag. So what do? Well, put it in the fuselage. So we did a study of that, and we're like, well, back of the cabin, you sit on top of your gas turbine. The gas turbine actually has a generator. That generator makes electricity, so the gas turbine does not actually directly propel the aircraft forward. It makes electricity. You have electric motors under your wing, and they actually drive you forward. Then the advantage is, behind your gas turbine, you can now have an emissions control device that takes out the NOx, and you can get a 95% NOx reduction for about 0.5% of fuel burn. Again, think back at our cost-benefit ratios. It's highly beneficial to society. Okay, now we've solved that as well. Now the big question is, can we combine all of this to get a net zero system? So low carbon fuels, whether sustainable aviation fuel, let's take a sort of more biomass-based thing, that's sort of a used cooking oil, right? That's the fat from your fries, or power-to-liquid fuels, or a hydrogen-driven plane. Take it together with our NOx reduction, and take it together with contrail avoidance. What do we get? How does the system look like? I could now show you pictures of the plane that we get when we do that. I thought I wouldn't do that. I thought I would actually show you what it actually gets us. And I'm coming back to the very beginning of my presentation. And now I'm not showing you cost per unit fuel burn. Now I'm showing you the total cost of operating the system, including the environment cost, and now we'll add the fuel cost on top of this. So let's look at it. Here's my baseline aircraft. That looks like in the beginning just with fuel burn on top. So that's the total cost of operating basically our global narrow body fleet with about 200 seats today. It's about 260 billion US dollars a year, including the environmental cost the environmental harm that we do. Let's go to our system. I can reduce the societal cost by about half. And how do I get to half? Well, I basically get my environmental costs pretty much to zero. It's not entirely zero. I only get 80% reduction because I have the life cycle problem. We solved that here by capturing some carbon and putting it under the ground, so offsetting the tiny little bit there. You have fuel costs that are quite a bit higher. So in this case, it's about 17% difference. That's, I think, a 17% difference. And here you, by the way, see the extreme need for efficiency improvements. This plane is about 20% more efficient than a conventional Jet A aircraft. This is how an aircraft looks today. Add 20% of efficiency loss on top of this, and you see your benefits get really small. We need this. Otherwise, the fuel costs actually get out of control in the future. We need to work on efficiency. It's really important, but not as a solution. It's an enabler for bringing more expensive energy on board. So now the last question is, do I need a hydrogen airplane? The hydrogen airplane actually, we find, doesn't actually give you any advantage. It's kind of the same. The uncertainties around there are interesting. They all overlap. So I can't tell you whether I need a SAF aircraft today or a hydrogen aircraft, and which is more beneficial. We think they're pretty much the same. So let's talk about implementation. So back to my hypothesis from the very beginning, which you may have thought like, this guy is crazy. So can we create the sustainable aviation system? Yeah, I think yes. But there's a lot we need to do. We need to transition to low carbon fuels. We need control avoidance. We need to think beyond climate and think about air quality as well. Very important because there are also trade-offs in that space which are really dangerous. And we need airframe and engine innovation, otherwise we get a problem with our energy costs. And that's a lot. And there's trillions of dollars of investment in there, especially on the energy side, just for aviation. Is it going to happen? Well, this will depend on a few things. Is the user willing to pay for some of these sustainability challenges? Because they will cost money. Are we all willing to pay for that? I see some positive signs there. This whole Scope 3 discussion in companies is really helping, because there's some really big companies out there that start to buy SAF, sustainable aviation fuels, at a premium for the flights they have. That's a really positive start. Access to capital for sustainable investments, that's a real thing for this aviation sector. So who's going to put the capital right now to do all of these pretty capital-intensive things, right? I mean, a new aircraft program costs billions. Where's this going to come from? Right? So we need that access. And the last thing is, I think we need some policy incentives here, and we need some regulation here. And it needs to be pretty dependable, because we're talking about investment goods here, like aircraft, that have a lifetime of like 30 years. If we're not careful, we're not going to create incentives that are long-term enough to actually make a cut here. That's, I think, the last piece that plays a pretty big role here. But I'm optimistic. There's something we can do, and hope we can work on it more. That said, thank you very much, and back to Eduardo.
Gracias, Florian. Excelente presentación. Very good. So I will ask the Professor Zhao, Professor Sadoway, and Florian to go back, because we will have a panel. Vamos a tener un panel, y Klaus Schleicher va a ser el moderador. Preparen sus preguntas, es el momento de preguntar, sobre todo a Florian, que no tuvimos la oportunidad de hacer preguntas antes. Así que, please, come on in. Klaus, it's your turn.
Do you want to be in the middle? Okay. I guess I get to sit in the middle. All right. Are there any questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'll kick it off. I have a couple of questions just to get the conversation started. Lately in the press, there has been a lot of mention about artificial intelligence, chatbots, ChatGPT. So what's that going to do to electrochemistry? What's that going to do to city planning? What's that going to do to flying? Or what impact will that have in the future?
Okay. I can start trying a little bit. First of all, this round of AI wave is become real and serious, right? We talk about AI for generations, right? So 50s, 60s, there were jokes like one professor said in April, says, oh, it's a summer project, right? Like hire a bunch of interns in the summer to solve the artificial intelligence problem, right? Clearly it's much, much challenging, but these days I think it's getting to a stage it will impact practice at a scale, right? Several things to mention. One is I mentioned in the talk about the predictive capacity, the way you can predict the future behavior, future system. That's really powerful. The second one, I think, is even more important is the generative AI, right? In many fashions, right? Particularly the language model that everybody probably hear of. I think in the not even about the future, in terms of the immediate impact, in terms of the change into the business processes, right? Mundane stuff, how we generate the PowerPoint. how to write legal contract, how to do this documentation. Those things will be impacted within, I'm talking about a 1 year, 6 month to 1 year time frame that will have big content impact. But beyond that, there's one key challenge, which is how do each company or industry preserve industry-specific knowledge? What I mean is that if we talk to several companies, they are in a dilemma. From one side is, if I do not engage with this OpenAI, this type of GPT family, right, I will quickly be out of date, right? I will lose the opportunity to improve my productivity. But if I do engage with this GTP or large language model, my knowledge base may quickly be sucked into the general language model, right? So the future generation GPT may take over whatever knowledge I have, right? So that's a major challenge that the company is facing. I'm now discussing the industry-specific large language model that will protect your knowledge base or intellectual properties. Yeah, now the line is very, very blurred. That's another kind of big area that would be important. Yeah, possibly for now.
Don, what do you think? What's going to happen with electrochemistry and artificial intelligence? Is it going to make things easier? Is it going to make...
Potentially it could, by codifying a lot of knowledge and being able to scan. I mean, if I choose aluminium and I want to say what could be my positive electrode, there's scanning through all of the chemical reactions that aluminium engages in, and then I can quickly look at that and say, these are a few candidates and these should go to the laboratory. There may be some possibilities to speed up parts of the inventive process. As far as just saying, like you have a Siri and say, Siri, give me tomorrow's battery. It doesn't work like that. So, but I think in terms of going through the calculations I go through in my head, but having some intelligence, artificial intelligence that can think the way I do and just go like this through the entire combinations, there may be some possibilities there. Optimization, but not like jumping to the next big thing.
Previously in the audience, there were a couple of people asking you, when can I have your batteries? And you said 10 to 20 years, and I saw people frowning. Would artificial intelligence help us to speed up the funding, the process of scaling up and going through the engineering processes that are needed?
Quite possibly, but quite frankly, I focus on the electrochemistry, getting the new technology, but the long journey, it goes out of my domain. The people that have worked on liquid metal battery have been mechanical engineers and chemical engineers who understand the upscaling. That's not my domain. So I would ask one of them to say, if you had something that had AI and rapid processing capability, would it have sped up the journey? I'd ask them to weigh in. My opinion is just an opinion. I have the humility to say, I don't know everything. That might shock you from an MIT professor, but it's true. I don't know everything.
Florian, in aviation, what's your take on it? I mean, there's lots of data points. There's lots of information to process. There's lots of opportunity to make it more economic viable.
No, absolutely. I think there's probably 2 to 3 things that you can think about. I mean, the obvious low-hanging fruit with AI is like, how can we make the system more efficient? We have a lot of data. Crunch this data, figure it out, right? I mean, people do interesting things from really small improvements. You would think like it doesn't really matter, but it adds up. Sort of thinking about like, well, do we use this taxiway on this airport really in the most efficient way? Or can we do this in a better way that, we reduce taxi times and get the aircraft into the air faster and we don't have the aircraft burn a lot of fuel on the ground? Things like that really add up. So it's really important to sort of use these kinds of kind of business intelligence tools where we have a lot of data, we can use this data, and AI clearly helps us in that sense. I think that's the first one. The second one is thinking a little more out of the box on sort of like what additional services sort of broader aerospace technology in combination with AI can actually provide, right? So the contrail tool that I showed you, for example, is a deep learning tool, right? This thing, we literally taught a computer what a contrail looks like on satellite imagery. I mean, we can't hire that many students that actually look over satellite images all the time. You have no idea how much time we spend labeling images, and this is the result, right? So the point there is AI really helps us to understand these kinds of patterns, and not only about contrails, but it can really sort of, as we think about aerospace technology, that really gives us sort of an opportunity to track a lot of things and create a lot of data from observation, right? Think about how much data a satellite actually collects every day. Like, what can we learn from this? Like, how can we make our world better, more efficient? What can we learn about this? I think it's not just aviation, it's sort of the potential of aerospace and the data it can create, I think, is huge, and this will really help us get through all of that data.
Okay. Are there any questions from the audience, or do you want me to direct it in another direction of the conversation? There is a question over there, and there's another one over there, so perfect.
Thanks to Florian for the presentation. That was interesting. So a question related to that, we talked about the emissions in aviation. I was just curious, compared to, like, let's say, to the, what part does aviation have in the global emissions? Do we have an idea about it, just to understand better?
Absolutely. So aviation climate footprint is about 2.5% of anthropogenic radiative CO2 and about 5% of anthropogenic radiative forcing. So it's smaller than you think. The problem that aviation has is because it's so tough to decarbonize, as other sectors start to decarbonize and aviation continues to grow, this could become easily 20-25% by 2050. So I would say it looks like not sort of the biggest fish in the aquarium right now, but it may very well become it. So so thanks for that question.
Thank you, Florian, for your presentation. Since we work in this area, we have seen a lot of out-of-the-box thinking from your presentation. So one aspect that you didn't touch on is regionalization. This all assumes everything you said is global. What about regionalizing the approach? So changing the airline business model completely and saying for flights between these regions, the best fuel solution is X. And then you avoid a global thinking, but maybe you move towards a feasible decarbonization pathway that is tailored to different origin destinations.
I think what you're mentioning is right in the sense that for two reasons. I actually am not sure that the way, I mean, today we fuel every aircraft with Jet A. I'm not convinced that such a system is the solution for the future. Could very well be that we will use different fuels for different parts of the aviation system. What you're saying is sort of the regional perspective of the same problem. Will we use different fuels in different regions? I think so. I mean, look at the picture that I showed you about hydrogen, right? If you really want to do this from wind and solar, then that might not be the solution for Southeast Asia. And then sort of the third point that you're making is, can we scale out of smaller pilots? Totally, right? We need to sort of think about, like, where can we start? However, what I have trouble with seeing is that we get like sort of a patchwork of different solutions in different places. The investment is just too large in vehicles. That an aircraft system is just too complex to have like a number of different platforms around the globe. I struggle with that thinking, but sort of like as a starting point, so sort of where do I start piloting? Where do I start employing? Yes, absolutely. And some heterogeneity I think we will see, but it will have limits.
Great. Let me maybe change a little bit of gears on it. So there was a lot of mention about CO2, and there's some people that say CO2 is bad, it's bad for the environment. There's another side that says CO2 is actually good, it has a value. It has a value in the cities, it has a value as a fuel, it has a value as converting to something else. What should we do with CO2? What's a good approach to it?
For your question.
Well, I think it's clear that CO2 is contributing to temperature rise. Now, can it turn into a fuel? Yeah, but you know, CO2 is very stable. You can break the molecule, but it takes energy to break the molecule because you're basically running things in reverse. So, you know, I go back to my demand that sustainability be profitable sustainability, and doing pirouettes to make, you know, at Arthur D. Little, they used to try to prove all of these things. They actually made a lead balloon. They actually made a silk purse out of a sow's ear. You can do this, but that didn't mean that all of a sudden everywhere we use lead balloons, because it is the smart thing to do. So can you turn CO2 into a fuel? I suppose you can, but I don't know how many of you said willing to pay, who's going to pay for this? I think that should shut down that discussion.
Well,
I think maybe to add to that point of is CO2 good, right? Is CO2 a resource? I think we have to be very careful with that discussion, because what Don said in his very first remark is true, right? I think we can say CO2 contributes to global warming. So using CO2 as a resource from processes that create CO2 is recycling it once, but you're still creating it. It doesn't make it better. Somebody still has to carry the burden of making that CO2 in the first place. Just by recycling it, it does not go away. So if you have a coal-fired power plant and you make CO2 and you sell that CO2 to somebody who then makes a fuel out of it, congratulations. Your CO2 burden is still on you, coal-fired power plant. I should use a different example. Because if you want to give that carbon penalty to the fuel, then the fuel makes no sense. So I struggle with that logic to see it as a...
Yeah, at the global scale, we just produce too much CO2 than the portion we can use effectively. Right. There's a different order of magnitude here.
So what's the solution? Really not produce CO2?
Yeah, not producing it. Yeah, we don't want to produce all these things and then develop technology and suck it back. Right? At the global scale, it just doesn't make sense. Yeah, we should reduce the emission of this.
Look, round numbers, it's 40 gigatons per year.
Yeah.
40 gigatons per year. That's a huge amount. And so we're at, what, 400 parts per million now. All right, so you talk about direct air capture and so on and so forth. You know, once it's up the stack, you have to go through a million molecules of nitrogen and oxygen to find the 400. There's so few of them, each of them has a name. And so now you find those 400 guys and you try to find them. Why don't you get them before they leave the building? But like it or not, we do not have the capacity to go zero CO2 right now. We don't, unless people want to live with the power interruptions and rolling blackouts and so on. We don't have it. So we have to figure out how to manage the situation. And so I think, you know, I mean, if you gave me the magic wand, if you made me the director of Department of Energy, I would shut down on most of the stuff they fund and say, look, this is what you have to come up with. You have to come up with a way to manage CO2 emissions, because we are going to continue to burn coal, gas for the foreseeable future. And we want to be able to do so, get the thermal value without CO2 going into the sky. And if you can't do that, you guys are all fired, and I'm going to find some people who can do the job. Because otherwise, this is Shindogu. I don't want Shindogu. Shindogu is totally useless inventions. It's Japanese. Totally useless inventions. So we know what has to happen. I mean, people asked me before about, well, do we have batteries? You know, the sun is always shining somewhere on planet Earth. You know, why can't we just ship it? Yeah, we can. We can ship it. I can ship electricity from China to California. All I need is room temperature superconductivity. So why aren't we working on it? Oh, you can't have room temperature superconductivity. No, you believe we can't have room temperature superconductivity. I imagine it. Make it work. And I'll give you a couple other, wild ideas. I mean, you're asking me for batteries that have 10 times the energy density. Am I coming up against the laws of physics? Probably. So I'm not going to promise that one. But room temperature superconductivity, I don't see why we're not spending money on that one. Well, there are PhDs, Nobel Prizes that were awarded for the proof that superconductivity couldn't exist beyond about 30 Kelvin. And then along came high TC, and then everybody went, oh, yeah, oh, okay, it works, but how does it stand up to theory? No, they didn't say that. They said the theory is wrong, the theory needs to be modified. So today the theory says you can't have room temperature superconductivity until somebody does it, and then they say, oh yeah, we knew that all along. No, you didn't.
Beautiful, thank you. It's just to give me an idea of what you guys just mentioned on it. So would it make sense in the future to actually have tools available that put every individual in the position to actually make a decision if I need to travel, if I need to see the mobility, how I'm traveling from point A to B, what does it cost me, how economic is it for me, and what does it cost the environment? So we empower people to make decisions to move from one point to another point, but really understanding what it means for the environment, what it means for their own expenses. Mm-hmm. Would that be something that we could actually consider in the future? Maybe we should start a company around that. Or you did already.
Yeah, I think we should talk about it today. I mean, the basic carbon accounting across all the domains, all the activities, it's just a necessity, right? If we were to say reduce something, take action, without any measurement of baseline, nobody's going to take any action, right? The reality is you need a whole system to do that. Just give me one idea, right? If you're building a house, you want to have like a zero-emission house, right? For now, you can have a pretty good idea on operational CO2 emission. You can do that, right? But if you were to understand, I buy this window, what's the embodied cost? I use this concrete, what's the embodied cost? I use this copper, what's the embodied cost? It's a hopeless exercise. As an individual person, you just cannot do it. Yeah, you may spend 10 years to coordinate. It shouldn't be a burden of the individual house builders to understand the entire history chain. The whole supply chain, at every step should report that. So it should be accumulated to me saying that if I buy this chair, put it in my home, this is 20 kilograms. That should be labeled together with the price of the chair. Similar thing when I buy this beam, everything, right? So the whole supply chain accounting needs to be done at every corner of the transaction. By the way, we do that for money because every time the transaction, money is accounted, we have a whole system to do that. We just didn't develop a similar system for carbon. There's no fancy technology required on this. It's just, are we serious about it or not?
Well, that's an interesting idea. That would be really an application where we really would empower people to make decisions
right. Yeah.
that actually have impact on the environment and the living.
Right. Give you an example. In food, right? Previously, when you buy food, what's the label there? Expiry date and a price. Now you look at the food, what it has. It has a nutrition table. Right. So why did it happen? Because we wanted it at that time. Right. Now it's the same thing. We should have food, have a nutrition table, we have a carbon table. That's all it is. Right.
Are there any political people in the room that can help us here? Are there any other questions from the audience? There's one in the back there.
So, hello. So regarding all the technical difficulties, which seems the most easy or the fastest or the possible way to achieve zero emissions of carbon? Like big batteries, like superconductivity at room temperature, or what?
Not sure I understood the question.
So, which is the easiest or most technically possible way to achieve zero emissions of carbon? Is there something we see, or it seems impossible at the moment?
Is there technology out there that will help us to achieve zero emission, or living of zero emission? What's the easiest way to get there? Anybody wants to take that question?
I'm happy to take it from an aviation side. I don't think there's a single silver bullet. I think there's a lot of things we need. I need to combine it together. I don't think there's the single thing that will get us there.
Right. Yeah, I would add, at MIT you often debate between the technology solution versus the behavior solution on that. Should we just let people be? If people want to pollute, to travel, let them be. We cannot change people's mind. Let's give them the best technology, just the technology will solve it. Versus, no, we want actually let people behave better, and the technology can facilitate this, right? I think we always debate this endless kind of a conversation on this, right? The reality I see in the urban mobility realm is you really have to do both, right? There's so much things that we human beings can choose to not to pollute, right? We just need a mechanism to incentivize this. For the part that the behavior is really difficult, that I think the technology have clearly important contribution to make that happen on this, right? That's the immediate. In the long term, of course, we do want the nuclear fusion to happen, right? If you talk about the human as a species in the next 50 or 200 years or beyond, you have to have that, right? That's, I think, is we showed that the Commonwealth fusion is not science fiction anymore. People really talk about it, getting to more practice. That I think will be a fundamental one.
Well, I think it's clear to me that for the foreseeable future, we will be burning carbon. And so the way to get to zero carbon emissions is to destroy the carbon dioxide before it leaves the stack. It's very clear. And by the way, I appreciate everything that Florian has said about efforts to mitigate the emissions from air flight. But practically speaking, they can be abated to a great extent. But I don't see any reason why in the world of the future, if we were able to destroy CO2 wherever the combustion occurs on the ground, and we get rid of CO2 emissions from steel, from cement, and I don't know what you could possibly do with agriculture, but there may be a few sources of CO2 emissions. And I don't think anybody, if I said this, that someone would say, you've got to get this denier out of the room. But I'm asking the question, so suppose we had a small amount of CO2 emissions coming from agriculture. Instead of telling the farmers, you have to cut back on this or cut back on that. And meanwhile, the consumer is going to the supermarket and feeling good about themselves because they're being so green. And all of a sudden, one day, the shelves are bare, and they're going to say, wait a minute, what's going on here? So we will have a certain amount of CO2 emissions, or GHG emissions. Let's make it broader. So there'll be some GHG emissions. And I think that the planet can sustain small amounts of GHG emissions. But when we're saying it has to be completely zero, everything zero, okay. I would like to taste some success along the way. But if you want to get rid of the CO2 emissions, you have to kill it at the source. Once it goes up the stack, the horse is out of the barn, so to speak. You know?
I mean, just to add to the question and answer my part of it, no, there's 40 billion tons of CO2 that like a human created every year to go in the atmosphere. And when you look at the contribution on it now, it's a third of mobility, a third is cement and construction, and a third is actually livestock, cows. So everybody talks about mobility, but not a lot of people talk about the livestock, because livestock produces methane, which converts into CO2, which is a big issue as well. No? So I think the urgency to do something about it is not well understood. So a lot of people talk about it, but you see very little action. And I think we need to wake up and we need to start doing things. Buying an electric car today is actually the battery, or the production of the battery produces more CO2 than a combustion engine in a lifetime. So that doesn't make any sense. So we need to really reconsider what technology we use to actually bring mobility of the future in an environmental environment. And how Don actually said it, it doesn't make sense to buy something which is interfere to the product which we have right now. You pay more money for something that does less.
Well, I guess it's pretty clear. Everybody should stay home. Don't drive, certainly don't fly, and don't eat. Just stay home.
If there are not, oh, there's another question over there. Thank you.
There are two questions, actually, but I want to do one in a kind of policy to Dr. Zhao, and the other more technical, perhaps, for Dr. The first question is about policy. You said, okay, we have to consider the, let's say, the price of carbon, the carbon credits, and it's something that we have in the EU already. And to me, it's a big risk of backfiring, and I'm going to tell you an example. The past year, we had the energy crisis in Europe. One of the reasons and one of the things that happened is that the price of raw materials like steel and concrete skyrocketed. Why? In Europe, we have done a big effort in electrifying the production of raw materials. So what happened? With the carbon credits and some issues with the gas from Ukraine, the price skyrocketed. Multinationals like the one I was working in were looking for steel in countries outside of the EU being produced with coal-fired furnaces because we had an perverse incentive. Okay, we were saving the world, but at the same time, we were making our raw materials more expensive, and therefore we were buying from outside of the EU in high carbon content products. And furnaces, steel producers, are closing in Europe due to the effort that they did in getting the, let's say, highest technology and highest energy efficiency in the process. So what do you think about that?
Thank you for the question. And first of all, when you talk about policy, you have to be really careful. They are all localized, right? Different city, different country, could have a different culture, different political content to that. What I suggested specifically is carbon accounting. How do you then translate into policy, translate into credit or physical control, etc.? That's another story, right? That requires understanding of politics, economic processes. I'm saying we need a carbon accounting as the baseline on this, right? Also, for example, Don mentioned about how do you really develop this profitable technology there, right? The carbon accounting itself is an enabler of those. So who develop the technology get rewarded of doing so, right, through this market process. The carbon credit as a specific policy instrument has a lot of issues, right? For example, if you only impose in a small part of the world, it will generate the perverse effect as you just described, right? Yesterday during the conversation we had, actually one audience asked a very tough question saying, we Europeans are doing as much as we can. If US and China don't do anything, what we did is just irrelevant in this, right? That's clearly a very important question. If a carbon credit is only localized into Europe, then you're not solving the problem, right? So here, how to translate from basic carbon accounting to the physical control, quantity control, or pricing, or carbon credit, that's another layer of the discussion, right? That we need economists, we need political science to help in this one. But what I'm saying is, before we that, if we don't have the accounting system as the infrastructure, none of this can work. That's just one component of the whole discussion.
Okay. Wonderful. So are there any other questions? Otherwise, I have one last one. So you as the faculty from MIT, if you have to leave one message to the audience of today, what would that be? What is the message? Don, you said don't eat, don't fly, don't move.
Well, okay, you can leave home, but walk. What's the message? Yeah, it's a very clear message. We will invent the solutions. It's all about inventing and aim high. They said in Paris, 1968, soyez réaliste, demandez l'impossible. And that's what I tell my students. Be realistic, ask for the impossible. And with enough ingenuity, the impossible becomes the inevitable. But if you don't aim high, you want 100% success, focus your efforts on optimizing that which exists, and you'll always be successful. The integral of an infinity of incremental changes is not the breakthrough.
Okay, super. Florian.
It's a really good question. Something very fundamental was just said, so I'm still processing that. I think the important piece in all of this is, as Don said, the solution will be invented. Yet I think that whatever that solution is, I don't think, coming back to the theme of the conference, that the solution will in any way be to restrict our mobility, because I think that's as much as we can't afford climate change to happen, we also can't go and sit in our house. And I think we need to be really careful in this discussion to restrict that movement, because that's going to come at a cost that none of us understand. And we don't understand because it's going to be very high as well.
Okay.
Yeah, in city planning, we talk about the difference between predict the future versus planning for the future, right? Here, I will call for a planning for the future notion here, right? We need to know what we want, right? And then look at, in order to happen, what's the necessary step? Because if you take the predict the future point of view, you may find we're stuck. We're stuck. We have so many constraints. We cannot solve this problem, cannot solve the problem. In climate change, I do observe this sense of hopelessness, right? But I'll give you a hopeful example. If you are a public health professional living in the United States in the 1960s, you would say, people smoke. What can I do? I'm stuck. We tried everything we can try. People still smoke. So we give up. The exact same sense of hopelessness in the 1960s. But look at today. After a generation, we solved that problem, right? Culture is powerful. Culture is sticky. But if you want to change it, it takes about a generation. I think we have a generation to make that happen.
Well, if I had to give one message, or haven't done some of these conferences and working in the Industrial Liaison program, that would be really do that what we do at MIT, question everything. Don't take things for granted. And it's us who needs to do something. It's not them or the professor or the faculty on it. We all have to do it, and we have to question things. So we take things very much for granted and say, that's the only way how we can do it. There's always a different way. It's called innovation, by questioning and finding something better. And I think I can only encourage everybody who's online in the room to do this, question everything. That will bring on innovation, that'll bring on change. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think Eduardo will actually have the last word, as always.
No, as always. Well, thank you, Professor Sadoway, Allroggen, and Zhao for coming all the way from Boston to here to spend this afternoon with us. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you for the people who are watching remotely. Y ahora voy a pasar al castellano. Creo que uno de los objetivos de estos encuentros es ayudarnos a reflexionar de los temas como el futuro de la movilidad y como tantos otros, ¿no? Que reflexionemos entre todos. Klaus, veníamos bien con el cemento y todo. Cuando tocaste el tema de las vacas ya no me gustó tanto. Porque el próximo paso es no comamos carne ni comamos jamón. Con la carne y el jamón, no. ¿Ok? Quería también agradecer a todos ustedes por haber venido hoy. Algunos que han venido desde Bilbao, Esquerricasco, de Getafe, algunos de Bruselas. Es un placer que hayan podido estar con nosotros hoy. Y por supuesto quiero hacer un muy especial agradecimiento a la Fundación Ramón Areces. Siempre es un placer venir aquí. Nosotros siempre decimos con Klaus, tenemos unas 15 conferencias en el mundo o más. La que más disfrutamos es esta, pero con diferencia, ¿eh? Así que espero que tengamos la oportunidad de seguir viniendo y disfrutar de Madrid y los excelentes restaurantes que hay por aquí, con la excusa de que tenemos que hacer una conferencia de algo. Así que, bueno, muchas gracias por venir. Querría invitar a Raimundo para que diga las palabras finales en representación de la Fundación. Y un abrazo también, ¿no?
Muchas gracias, Eduardo. Espero que no se lo digas a todas eso de las 15 conferencias y el gusto en Madrid, pero sé que lo pasas muy bien, como lo pasamos nosotros con vosotros. No se asusten, que termino en 1 minuto y medio. Lo que sí quisiera, primero, es saludar la presencia hoy entre nosotros de Elaine Papulias, de la Universidad de Harvard, a quien agradezco que haya venido a ver hoy cómo es la relación de la Fundación con el MIT en la práctica. La verdad es que es una relación que nosotros apreciamos enormemente. Tocamos las fronteras del conocimiento. Esto es un festival de creatividad, de ideas, como diría el profesor Sadoway, the wild ideas, que es lo que buscamos. Lo que queremos es que se presenten en la Fundación wild ideas. Mañana tenemos, sin ir más lejos, para que vean que todo este proceso tiene una continuidad, una jornada sobre innovación y tecnología en el ámbito de las ciencias cuánticas, que estará presidida por un premio Nobel, el profesor Zhao. Quiero expresar a mis amigos del MIT y a los profesores, a quienes agradezco una vez más su venida a España, mi admiración por el desarrollo de los debates. Francos, y estoy pensando, el profesor Sadoway me ha dado una idea, que es que a partir de ahora voy a invitar siempre a un jubilado, porque son los únicos que se atreven a decir lo que piensan y decirlo de verdad. Gracias, profesor, por tu sinceridad y por esas wild ideas, que de verdad es el objetivo que tenemos nosotros. El próximo día 7 de junio, ya termino, vamos a tener otro seminario como este, organizado con la Fundación Nobel, que también va a contar con un premio Nobel, el profesor Morten Medal, premio Nobel, creo que es de Química del año pasado, que se titula Inspired by Nature, y cuyo tema es cómo el contacto con la naturaleza, con las artes, con la vida, puede fomentar una vocación científica y un avance en la ciencia. Creo que es un tema apasionante en el que me encantaría invitaros, y de hecho estáis todos absolutamente invitados. Y citando por último al profesor Sadoway, tiene toda la razón cuando dice que hay que inventar las soluciones. Los problemas ya llegarán. Muchas gracias.